Okay, we're about ready to start. If people could take their seats. Okay, welcome to day 2 and to our measurements and methods morning. The regular attendees among you will notice that we've pushed the alliteration theme that bit further this year by adding measurement alongside methods. So we have 4 papers. 2 papers focused on measurement, 1 paper that kind of bridges measurement and methods, and then 1 that is a methodological piece. And I'm going to just very briefly summarize them in order. So Melissa is going to talk to us about how we might develop a measurement way of measuring that means we can move beyond statements like institutions matter. So this paper provides a systematic characterization of education bureaucracies in terms of the completeness and coherence of public basic education systems. She's going to talk about 3 functions and 3 task dimensions and use this framework to collect data for 4 middle-income countries. And this is something Lant is going to love. I know that there's a strong correlation between the coherence measure and student achievement. It's positive. Noam is going to talk about a new data set where he measures learning across 100, he and co-authors, many of whom are in the room, measure learning across 164 countries. The aim there is to produce a globally comparable measure of learning. And that's going to feed into the Human Capital Index, which we're going to hear more about in the lunchtime session from Penny. So the key thing here methodologically or in terms of measurement is how to construct a learning exchange rate that means you can link international assessments such as PISA and TEMS to regional counterparts. And Noam is going to explain to us how that works, and then he's going to tell us the results of that exercise. Then moving on to Emily's paper, which kind of bridges both measurement and methods. So she's going to talk about cheating in Indonesian national exams. So as she mentioned to me, seeing a linkage to the session, which might not be obvious to everyone. If you can't get a sense of cheating, then in a way you can't measure learning. Methodologically, she's going to introduce something called the integrity score and tell us how that helps to get a handle on how much teaching there is. And she's going to tell us who cheats and by how much in Indonesian exams. It's quite startling that 34% of students are cheating and inflating scores by as much as 15%. Then Eduardo is going to finish the session by talking about meta-analyses. They're increasingly common within the field of education. And the question here is, are researchers understanding the results in the right way? And he's going to talk us through prediction intervals rather than confidence intervals, where prediction intervals take into account the differences between studies. And his bottom line is going to be that there's so much heterogeneity, this calls into question the whole idea of identifying what works. Okay, so that's what we have in front of us, so I'm going to hand straight over to Melissa.
Okay, thank you, Claire, and good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Edelman. I work in the Education Global Practice at the World Bank. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning, and I hope you've had your morning coffee because I'm going to dive into the very exciting topic of bureaucracy for the next 15 minutes. Okay, so the research that I'm presenting to you is pretty new. We're just finishing it up, and it's a paper with several of my colleagues at the bank, some of whom are here, and it's part of a broader research project on education management in Latin America. And this particular effort is really trying to dig a little bit more into bureaucracy. And the sort of general motivation for this research is really the same as the motivation for RISE, essentially, right? Which is that we know that education systems in developing countries are not producing as much student learning as we think they could or should, that Noam will also talk about next. In Latin America in particular, a lot of people think it's a first-order problem for Latin America and helps to explain sort of the region's relatively disappointing growth performance over the past several decades. So we know of the many factors that could go into the education production function, that the level and quality of inputs matter, and we know that behind those inputs there are institutions. And there is a literature that makes the case for the importance of institutional characteristics. And when I say that, I mean things like autonomy, accountability, the structure of the market, so the extent of private sector competition, that sort of thing. So we have some pretty good literature that shows us that this does matter. But obviously moving from saying, okay, well, institutions matter to if we change specific institutional features, this is what we expect to happen, is quite complicated for many reasons. And so what we end up seeing is that most quantitative research focuses either at the level of elected politicians and using elections for identification strategies, which is quite nice and important, or at the level of frontline service delivery. So for us in education, that's usually school teachers and school principals. And then leaves basically in between those two kind of a black box of bureaucracy. And so with this project, we were looking at education management in Latin America, and we had several research papers on the school level, but we thought to ourselves, okay, we really can't leave it just at that. We have to figure out some way to try to address kind of this bureaucracy in between. And so this is kind of the genesis of where this idea came from. So basically, this is what we asked ourselves, is whether we could try to construct quantitative and meaningful measures of bureaucracy in education. So we start actually from a 2006 paper by Lant and a co-author, Varad Pandey, that basically conceptualizes education bureaucracy as a set of functions, and then each function as a set of tasks. And we use that conceptualization to develop new measures that try to answer a series of questions. So the questions that we try to answer are here. So basically, we try to answer whether tasks are clearly articulated and allocated in regulation. So in legislation, we call that sort of de jure. We ask also whether the allocation, what level the allocation is in terms of the education system. We don't have a normative stance on this necessarily, but we think it could be informative. And then we ask whether bureaucrats share a common understanding of that task allocation, so with each other, and also whether their understanding matches up with the de jure allocation. And then finally, we also try to construct measures of how well tasks are actually executed. And then we ask ourselves, are these measures meaningful? So in terms of whether common understanding of allocation matters for execution, and whether either of those things matters for actual student learning. Okay, so we see this as being related to several different strands of literature that you are all probably very familiar with, so I will not spend time on that. And so I'll go through, since this is a method session, a bit more in detail about exactly what we are doing. So essentially, going back to the Pritchett and Pandey framework, we identify basically 10 core functions that are within the purview of, we'd say, probably most countries' basic education systems. For us, we're taking a Latin American view because that's where we did this research. So, we could discuss and adjust based on the actual context. But in the Latin America case, these 10 seem to us to be sort of the right set. And then each function we define as being made up of tasks in 3 dimensions. So essentially planning, implementation, and sort of monitoring and identification of problems. So this was to try to capture the different types of tasks that a function would really consist of that would be done within a bureaucracy. And so this is specifically what I'm talking about. So these are the 10 functions that we have. So everything from learning materials, student assessments, to a bunch of personnel functions. And then we cross these with the monitoring, planning, and implementation dimensions, right? So doing this cross of these 10 functions by 3 dimensions is how we identify tasks. So we identified many tasks and spent a lot of time on trying to winnow down the list for tractability, to be able to collect data and not go around and try to ask people about 300 things. So we winnowed it down to basically 51 tasks in that function dimension crossing. And then we constructed instruments to try to capture these measures of task allocation and task execution that I talked about. So, okay, so a specific example to tell you what I'm talking about. So in the function of school directors, a school principal hiring and assignment. So these are some of the task allocation questions. So for example, the planning dimension, we asked about who is responsible for setting the qualification requirements that new directors must meet. right? Just as one example. And then on execution, we asked questions like this, which is that the last time that a need for a new director was communicated, was that need met? And this was sort of a multiple choice answer that we offered. So, everything from no, that post was never filled, all the way to yes, we got the right person basically within a reasonable amount of time. So basically, this is what we have for all of the functions that I just showed you. Okay, so then we applied this in 4 countries in Latin America. So Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Peru. Only 3 states in Brazil, not all of Brazil. And we picked these countries for a few different reasons. So one is, we think they reflect different types of systems. So everything from sort of municipal primary education in Brazil to sort of like provincial responsibilities in Peru to much more sort of national systems that are generally run from the center, like Guatemala and the Dominican Republic. And then we did 3 types of data collection. So we did a legislative review, structured interviews with system officials at different levels, and then phone surveys with school directors. Okay, so just to get into a little bit more on the actual data collection. So the legislative review for each country, it was carried out by a sector expert and basically identifies what we call this de jure allocation of tasks as defined by the current legislation or regulation. The structured interviews with the officials were also done by that same sector expert in each country. The sample selection process for this was, basically taking advantage of our relationships with governments to help us identify the right people to interview, and also sort of availability and that sort of thing. And the instruments asked about the task allocation, like I mentioned before, and then if a respondent says that yes, their level of government is responsible for a particular task, we then go on to ask them about task execution, because they should, in theory, know. And then the last set of data collection we did is phone surveys with directors in each country. And we used a survey firm in Mexico to do this. So the way that we selected our sample was based on the system, the local level system officials that we were able to interview. From their local level is where we drew our random sample of school directors. And so the instrument mirrors the structured interviews, but we ask school directors more questions about task execution, because at the level of the school, they're going to see much more of the results of that execution, even if they're not the ones responsible for actually making those decisions. Okay, so what I'll do with my remaining 5 minutes or so is just kind of give you a few highlights of the results that we have so far. So basically just starting with kind of de jure task allocation. So there are a couple of things that you could take away from this table. So as you would expect, because these systems are structured differently, we see that task allocation varies the way you would expect it to. So in Brazil, where municipalities in most states run primary education, we see that that's where most of the tasks are actually allocated, right? So the local level in Brazil is the municipality. Versus Peru, which I mentioned before, has been in a process of devolution of responsibilities sort of to the provincial level, which is the subnational level, and we see a good share of tasks there. Unlike the Dominican Republic and Guatemala, which are primarily still making decisions at the national level. So that is sort of, I think telling us that we are measuring something that more or less makes sense. And then the other thing that we found striking about these results is across those countries, regardless of the structure, relatively little is getting decided at the school level. So, whether or not you have a municipal system or a federal one or whatever. And we think that this is relevant because a lot of our energy goes, when I say us, I mean as the World Bank, the education practice, we spend a lot of energy on supporting schools directly at the school level. We talk a lot about school-based management. We talked about that here yesterday as well. But we see that there are a lot of decisions being made, a lot of responsibilities being carried out above the school level. And this to us suggests that maybe we're not paying enough attention to that, sort of black box of bureaucracy in between where important things are happening. So that's kind of the takeaway from there. Okay, and so moving on from task allocation to what we call here coherence. So For us, we were thinking about calling this coherence or alignment or whatever, but basically we're considering this common understanding as a form of coherence. And what we're measuring is basically a couple of things. One is whether there's a common understanding between the de jure allocation of tasks and the de facto perceptions of bureaucrats. So that's one. Now, the second is, okay, well, given that lots of organizations have unwritten rules, maybe the rules don't really matter that much as long as everybody has a common understanding of what should actually be happening. So we also look basically at de facto coherence among bureaucrats themselves. So we measure that in two ways. One is school directors with their local official, that person that we interviewed, and then just school directors among themselves within a locality. So for us, I think, related to the RISE framework, to Lance's paper from 2015, we're sort of diving very in detail into the delegation element of management, basically, is sort of where we see this fitting within the overall RISE framework, is really in there. And so we use these measures of what we call incoherence to see sort of what the state of task understanding is across the countries in our sample. So basically, kind of one of the headline statistics is across the countries that we have, the 4 countries and the levels of the system, bureaucrats correctly identify about 56% of their tasks, their de jure tasks, as their own. Sorry, this slide is wrong. It's not 56% of bureaucrats. It's bureaucrats identify 56% of their tasks correctly as their own. So there's quite a bit of bureaucrats saying that they're responsible for things that they're not responsible for, and saying that they're not responsible for things that the legislation says they are responsible for. So there is that. But there is, I'll show you in a second, that there's a lot of variation. And then across countries, again, 44% of tasks are coherent between school directors and their local officials. And within school directors themselves, they're more coherent. So about 67% of tasks are coherent between school directors themselves within a locality. But probably more importantly, we see a lot of variation across countries. So basically, this is looking from the perspective of a school. So the school director, their responses compared to their local officials and the legislation. And basically, this is sort of a measure of full coherence. So each observation is a school director. So if a school director, basically what we're measuring is the school director's responses to task allocation, and then whether or not their responses match up with both their local officials and the legislation. And so we call that full coherence. So you can see that there's quite a range. So in Guatemala, on average, school directors are identifying 13% of tasks as being fully coherent. So they're giving the same response as everyone else, all the way to Brazil, where 47% of tasks are fully coherent. So there's a lot of variation. And so basically then we, just to give you in the last 20 seconds kind of a suggestive idea of what we're looking at now, and still working on this, is, are these measures meaningful for something? So we just run very simple regression looking at this kind of measure of full coherence on the outcomes of the latest national student assessment that we have for all the countries except Guatemala. And so, here's the table that I'll show you for 2 seconds, where basically we do get a strong negative correlation here between incoherence and student learning. So basically, to put that in terms, we've got 51 tasks. So for every 5 tasks that are incoherent, if you add 5 more, then that's 0.2 standard deviations lower student learning outcomes. And so what we're doing right now is working on those task execution measures to see if this relationship that we're seeing is explained by the quality of task execution. So yeah, we've got lots of things that we're thinking about. Obviously, this is only looking at this management piece. We haven't looked at financing at all. So it's one thing to be responsible for something. It's another to have the financing to do it. And so yeah, I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Got it. I was wondering how to get this to work. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Excited to share this paper, Measuring Human Capital, with co-authors Penny Goldberg, who's here, Simeon Jankov, and Harry Petrinos at the World Bank. And I know it's a measurement session. I actually took out some of the measurement details, but I'm happy to come to that in the Q&A because you only have 15 minutes, so you have to pick. So kind of starting with the definition of human capital, interesting as we kind of looked at this, the precise definition is not kind of word by word agreed on, but notionally knowledge, skills, competencies embedded in people that contribute to productivity. So there's a rich theory linking human capital to economic development, starting with Becker kind of formally and popularizing this in economics, and quite a rich theory on this. You see the big H in the aggregate production function. This is really core in economic theory. Typically, it's been proxied by measures of schooling, partially because this data has been available across many countries and over time. So there's very famous databases such as Barrow-Lee, Cohen-Soto, and others, and it was sort of considered a pretty good proxy for a long time. We know, and most people in this room know, and Lan has been saying, and many, many others in the World Development Report 2018, that schooling does not necessarily produce learning. So this is just one graph, but this has been shown many times. This is enrollment rates increasing. This is from Lee and Lee. And this is our measure of learning, showing that it's actually stagnating over the last 10 years. I wouldn't overinterpret this. There's a few things driving this, but this just shows the striking contrast. So schooling does not necessarily produce learning. We know from a lot of accumulating literature that schooling can sometimes fail to deliver on the predictions from these economic growth theories. So some literature on this. But when you use learning, you get much stronger associations. So a very famous paper by Hanushek and Wosman, World Development Report 2018, chronicles this in depth. So this is a nice graph from the World Development Report, essentially showing that when you look at years of schooling, conditional on test scores, to annual GDP per capita growth, you're getting kind of a flat relationship, but with learning, you're seeing that positive association. So can we come up with a better human capital measure on a global scale that actually measures knowledge and skills and is available across countries and over time? So there are a bunch of assessments that do measure learning internationally. So some famous ones, PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, but they mostly cover kind of North America, Europe, a bit of Asia, some Latin America. But you can see a huge omission here in sub-Saharan Africa and many other countries. Small sample size, N of 50 to 70. So it's really kind of a small sample, but also a certain tail of the distribution. So there maybe is a lot of things that we're not learning just from these assessments. And so in this paper, we aim to bridge this gap, and we put a lot of learning outcomes on a kind of a global scale and cover 164 countries from 2000 to 2017. You can see we're able to fill out a bunch of countries here. So in this paper, we're presenting one of the largest globally comparable learning outcomes databases and over time as well, very current data up to 2017. We also are going to share a few stylized facts that show how you might use this. So the goal of this paper is largely to actually produce a public good, which is this database, which we hope many, many folks use for research and policy. And we do show how it can kind of be used in a series of applications that are motivating. So this database is part of the Human Capital Index that the World Bank has recently launched. So this is a very nice infographic that we did not produce, but the World Bank did produce. And you can see the various components. One of is the harmonized test scores, harmonized learning outcomes, among others. So methodology, there's a literature, kind of economics/education, creating comparable learning outcomes. So there's quite a rich literature on this. The basic intuition is you actually do have a lot of learning assessments in developing as well as developed countries. So developed country often will be PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, but there's also a series of other assessments like SACMAC in East and Southern Africa, YESE in Latin America, PASEC in West Africa, EGRA data as well in a bunch of countries. So if you can find a way to sort of make these assessments speak to one another, you can put them on a global scale. It's not that there's no learning data in developing countries. There actually is. It's just sort of making these speak to one another. So the basic intuition of what we do is we create a learning exchange rate between these various assessments. I've actually moved a bunch of the kind of details to the appendix, but I'm happy to come to it if folks would love to discuss. But the basic intuition here is you can take a country or a set of countries that participate in both assessments in the same point in time in the same year for the same subjects and schooling level. So say, for example, Botswana participates in TIMSS 2011. You get a math and science score in primary schooling. They also participate in SACMEC primary schooling. They've also got math and science scores as well as reading. You can now see the relationship between these assessments, and there's various linking methodologies to then kind of produce that exchange rate. So that's the basic intuition for how this is done. And the more countries that participate in these sort of pairwise matches, the better this is, and so forth. And there's sort of a series of assumptions that make this the most credible. We compare this to what is often considered the gold standard in linking methodology, which is item response theory. So in item response theory, there's actually overlapping test items between these assessments and sort of a robust methodology for making those comparable. Unfortunately, there is not enough item overlap in all of these assessments over the same period and over all of these countries. But there is a project called the LINKS project, which takes a subset of countries that do have this and a subset of kind of subjects and levels. So it's mostly for reading and primary. And they do this from the 1970s, actually, for that. And so where there's overlap, we're able to see how well our methodology does relative to this item response theory. This is, I believe, from 2000, 2015, a kind of average score. And you see that our methodology does really well at the macro level with a correlation of over 0.97. For anyone who's worked with test scores, which I know is many folks here, we know test scores are quite finicky. But at the macro level, it seems to be really robust. And we actually compare it to a few other methodologies, equipercentile linking as well. So I have a bunch of those comparisons in the appendix. And again, we're seeing over a 0.98 correlation among these. So it's doing pretty well. So just to describe the database, it covers over 98% of the world from 2000 to 2017. So we think that's pretty good. We're still adding more countries in the future updates. The database itself, we sort of have a cookbook in the paper for how you might use it and the various variables. The goal is to be pretty disaggregated. So a lot of these kind of past databases have been very aggregate, and there's a lot that's kind of hidden in there. So sort of combining different schooling levels, primary and secondary, across subjects. We actually disaggregate this. So you have mean scores, you have it by year, not just 5-year intervals, by exact year, by level, primary versus secondary, by gender, by subject, by original test, so you can see where the data is coming from, as well as standard errors to quantify uncertainty. And it's going to be publicly available and updated at regular intervals. And the goal is to really have this kind of transparent, so users of the data can actually see and get a sense of how this data is all coming together. So a few just kind of descriptives here, putting some kind of selected countries. So one, you can see Russia's pulled ahead of the US. That's actually largely driven by their recent Pearls data, for those who've been following that. Chile, a bunch of kind of the top Latin American countries outperforming some of the Eastern European counterparts, Georgia. Saudi Arabia, relatively rich, not doing so well. At the bottom here, this is kind of a trend that's known, a bunch of the sort of resource-rich countries not producing the level of human capital that their wealth might predict, and a bunch of countries in Africa at the tail end of the distribution. You see Singapore, this is the average score over 2007, 2017. So this is capturing variation, this plot. You can see Singapore doesn't have much. It's actually been kind of at the top for a while. So potentially there's sort of a diminishing returns effect here that's kind of to be explored. Rwanda has low variation for a different reason. It just doesn't have much data. So this is to sort of just show that there's different reasons for this. And so kind of users of the database should do this quite knowingly. Russia has high variation because it's improved relatively quickly, whereas South Africa has high variation because it's actually declined relatively quickly. So this is another graph showing GDP per capita, log GDP per capita relative to learning outcomes. So this sort of highlights how wealth might predict how well you do, and a few trends that you can observe here. Some of these are not surprises because they're already known from sort of PISA, TIMSS, et cetera, but Vietnam doing very well, Singapore, Poland, Cuba, Bulgaria. On the lower end here, kind of lower than you might think from wealth, you're seeing a lot of the resource-rich countries, Qatar, Kuwait, not matching up on human capital here. South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, India as well. And this is sort of a select set of large developing countries. So showing that sort of there's a distance to the frontier here. Given the wealth, there's actually scope to really kind of improve human capital. And you don't necessarily have to be wealthy to achieve good human capital. This is another interesting descriptive. This is years of school. This is expected years of school from the Human Capital Index relative to learning. So Ghana, we heard from senior officials yesterday, does quite well on years of schooling, but not so well on learning, kind of a striking example and outlier here. Kenya, on the other hand, does quite well on learning as well as years of schooling. That also was brought up yesterday. Vietnam, a few other countries where you see doing relatively well on expected years of schooling, but not on learning: Nigeria, South Africa, and India. I think just an interesting thing to highlight is there's actually a lot of variation, conditional on years of schooling. There's a lot of countries that actually do produce much higher learning, showing that it's not necessarily just a function of years of schooling. There's actually a lot of scope to improve conditional on years of schooling. Stylized facts in 4 minutes. So this is by region. This is just enrollment rates. You can see lower to start with in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but going up. Learning stagnating across most regions. Again, this sort of captures a few things. It captures a bit of kind of new countries coming into the database, as well as same countries' performance over time. So you need to dig in further, and we have more on this in the paper to sort of fully interpret this, but this shows the rough trends. On gender, you're seeing that the gender gap is flipped between enrollment and learning. So whereas girls sort of under-enroll in school in many regions, in some it's on par. On learning, you're seeing girls overperform. This could be driven by selection. And so kind of if you look at a few examples, in MENA, girls are under-enrolled but overperform. So maybe it's just the ones that are in school are sort of the ones who kind of have higher scores. But other counterexamples in sub-Saharan Africa, under-enrolled but still underperforming. So it's not clear selection is kind of the full part of the story here. There's sort of more to explore. Human capital, when measured by learning, has been shown to be associated with growth before, but a much smaller subsample. We actually show that this holds up really well when you include the global distribution. So this is encouraging. It wasn't just that this was the case for 50 countries. It actually does hold up pretty well across the entire global distribution. So that's encouraging, and I believe this paper is one of the first to show that it's holding on just so wide a scale. These associations are heterogeneous. So one of the nice features of the database is because it's much larger, you can actually get some heterogeneity because you're not just looking at 5 countries, you're looking at a decent chunk. And so we find some interesting trends here. This is just one. We see that the association with growth for kind of current income status is highest on currently upper middle income countries. And looking at initial income quartile at the beginning of this period, it's that second quartile. So this is interesting because it might suggest that there's sort of a human capital sweet spot. Where sort of potentially maybe on the sort of low end, just the labor markets aren't rewarding human capital in the same way yet. Maybe they're not as thick. So there's sort of a variety of reasons. But sort of on this middle space, there's potentially kind of a sweet spot to be explored further. But you can actually get at heterogeneity with this database, which has not really been as possible before. In a final stylized fact, development accounting. So there's a very large literature on this, trying to explain cross-country income differences attributed to human capital. It's largely unsettled, and it varies pretty wildly from potentially 0 to almost everything. So that's kind of as wide an interval as you can get. One of the reasons, there's a few reasons for this, is because it's been hard to measure quality. And so there's been a lot of kind of efforts to measure quality directly and simply. And so you see this wide variation. So this is just sort of one baseline accounting result. And you can see for kind of some of the earlier studies in this literature, which largely used quantity measures, enrollment, the share of human capital hovered around kind of 10%. But when you use quality, we're finding it's closer to 20% double on these decompositions. That's close to Schulman 2011, which uses immigrant returns to also try to get at quality. So that's kind of nicely matching up. On another decomposition, here, looking at the more recent literature that looks at quality, which ranges from nearly all to potentially none, we're finding that if you just set the parameter value to 0, so essentially this is years of schooling, on quality, I didn't have a chance to go into kind of full depth on sort of the parameter values of this. It's around that 20-30%, which is close to what we were seeing before. If you're now looking at kind of returns to quality, and we look at various pieces here on the order of 20%, and you're actually including quality, you're seeing this go up to 40%, which is close to some of the recent literature sort of in the middle here, 50 to 60%. So essentially, we're seeing that when you use this measure, you get something a bit more reasonable sort of in the middle of the literature instead of this massive variation, zero to everything. In conclusion, 7 seconds, to understand and track human capital, we think that, and link it to economic development, there's a need for this globally comparable learning outcomes measures. We construct a database of 164 countries from 2000 to 2017, covering 98% of the global population. The data is going to be publicly available and updated regularly, and we hope that many folks use it. In a first set of motivating applications, we present a few stylized facts. Schooling is not learning, that's known, we sort of show that again. The gender gap seems to be flipped. Learning is associated with growth on a global scale. Associations with growth are heterogeneous, and there might be this sort of human capital sweet spot. There's other heterogeneity analysis you can run. And for the development accounting contribution, we're finding between a fifth to half, which is roughly sort of in the middle of a wildly varying literature. So there's been large policy demand for this already. It's a core part of the Human Capital Index. USAID has also included this in the country self-reliance, and actually this measure is starting to be included in a lot of different indices and measures, which is exciting, seeing learning put at the center of these various efforts. In the future, we are going to add data. We're also going to improve the methodology over time, so there's sort of a longer research agenda. And we also hope to isolate value added. So this is sort of trying to get at some of these selection effects, potentially comparing household to school level learning. So that's something that we hope to look at in the future, and adding additional variables like returns, et cetera. So thank you.
Thanks. So we'll wait for a bit. Yeah, so hi, I'm Emily, and today I'll talk about joint work with my teammates from the Rise Indonesia team, Menno Pradhan, Daniel Suryadama, and Arya Swanata, and together with Rahmawati from the testing arm of the Ministry of Education in Indonesia. And I'll talk about cheating on national exams in Indonesia, where we're interested in identifying how big this problem actually is in terms of exam scores. So yesterday, Apijit already talked about that it is a big problem in India, and today I'll show you that it's also a big problem in Indonesia. So journalists have written quite a bit about cheating on the national exams already, both in national news, like on your left, and international news, as an economist here on the right. And what they write about is that there's actually cheating going on throughout the exam procedure. So it already starts at the printing companies that are leaking answer sheets to the students. Teachers are providing answers to the students and allowing students to copy each other's answers in the classroom. And this cheating is all sort of induced by the stakes that are attached to the exam. So the Indonesian national exam is used to measure two things, that is student achievement and school quality. So for students, it's mainly their national exam score is mainly important for their acceptance into secondary school and university. So the national exam is taken in grades 6, 9, and 12. And until 2016, it was also a condition for their graduation. And for schools, it's mainly a reputation thing. So if schools score low on average on the national exam, they'll look bad and, well, they don't like it. So that way, both for students and for teachers and principals, there are incentives to cheat on the national exam. So I think that every one of you here will agree that cheating is bad and should not be happening. But so I would just like to emphasize two things. So first, when cheating is happening at a large scale at a national exam, that means that you're not actually measuring learning, while the national exam is one of the main information sources for government officials for how much learning the education system is actually producing. And second, when students and teachers already know beforehand that they can actually cheat their way through the exam, they might put less effort into studying and into teaching in order to pass the exam. So yeah, in Indonesia, the exam pass rates are close to 100%, but according to the PISA, 42% of the 15-year-olds who are, most of them are in their exam year, are actually functionally illiterate. So how is it possible that all of these students pass their exam while they don't have the skills necessary to do so? Well, could be cheating. But what we don't know is how big is this problem actually in terms of exam scores. So there's all this speculation about cheating in the news articles, but yeah, how many schools are cheating and how much are they cheating? So in order to identify this, we exploit a national policy implemented by the government of Indonesia for junior secondary schools. So since 2015, the government of Indonesia had been calculating this so-called integrity score. So what they do is there's this algorithm, and this algorithm checks if there's patterns in the answer sheets of the students, and that way they can get a sense of, they can get suspicious of cheating in these exam scores. And they calculate this for all schools since 2015. And we combine this with another intervention that they're doing, which is computer-based testing. So with computer-based testing, students just get the questions directly from a server, circumventing these printing companies and the teachers. So they cannot do these traditional cheating practices as described in the news articles. And this is slowly being phased in. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So first, I'll explain a bit more about this integrity score. So this algorithm is developed by the testing arm of the Ministry of Education, and it's based on an already developed literature on how to identify cheating based on answer patterns. And it's a score that ranges between 0 and 100. So a higher value means that there's higher integrity and less cheating. The government uses a few cutoff values. So they use, for example, a cutoff value of 70 to say that there's, for the schools that have a score lower than 70, they feel that there's sufficient or like convincing evidence that there's substantial cheating going on. Then between 70 and 80, there's probably still cheating happening, but they cannot be very sure about it. And then for schools with an integrity score above 80, they believe that these are honest schools that are not cheating. So here in the graph, you see the distribution of the integrity score with the red line indicating the 70 cutoff value. Most of the schools actually have a score around 80, but as much as 34% of the schools have a score below 70 in 2015. So here you see the correlation between this integrity score and exam scores. Up to a score of 80, there's a clear negative correlation between the integrity score and exam score. So as expected, the schools that are scoring very low on this integrity score have very high exam scores. And then when you look at the schools with an integrity score above 90, they also score very high. So these should be the very good schools. But in order to see how much these schools are actually increasing their scores, we use the phase-based implementation of the computer-based testing. As I said before, the students get the questions directly from a server. So the printing companies cannot leak the answer sheets. Teachers and principals don't have the answer sheets beforehand. And the students also get the questions in different order, and they actually get different questions from this big item bank that is at the server. So it's also very difficult for the students to copy the answer. So we believe that it is actually basically impossible to cheat in this system, so that the computer-based test scores are reflecting the true learning outcomes of the students. So here you see the phase-based implementation. So schools need to have sufficient computers, and they need to have access to electricity and access to internet to be able to implement the CBT. And when they think that they're ready, they can apply to the central government, and the central government will check if they are actually ready and they can implement it. So in 2015 and 2016, actually, pretty small number of schools have implemented, because there's about 35,000 schools that fall under the Ministry of Education. But by 2018, 47% of the schools are implementing the CBT. So here I plotted the trends of the exam scores of the groups of schools that implemented the CBT, and this graph shows two things. First, between the red lines, you see the difference between the year before implementing CBT, so when they were still doing the exam on paper, and then the year that they actually implemented CBT. And what you see is that there's a drop in scores between these years. And the second thing that it shows is that the schools that are implementing CBT are not a random sample. So the schools that have high exam scores and they also have higher integrity scores, those are the ones that switched first. So to be able to say something about how much cheating is going on in the whole country, we also need to get a sense of how much cheating is happening in the group that is not implementing CBT yet, which is likely to be more than the schools that have switched so far. So how we do that by using this correlation between the integrity score and the exam scores to predict what the non-cheating score would be for the schools that are not implementing CBT yet. So first, as I showed in the previous graph, well, and argued, is that CBT limits cheating. Then the second thing I use, and I'll show in the next slide, is that the integrity score is actually very predictive of the drop in scores after these schools implement CBT. And then I use the interaction between the paper-based score and the integrity score to predict the non-cheating score for the schools that are still doing the paper-based exam. Here you see this correlation between the integrity score and the drop-in scores, as I said before. So on the x-axis you have the integrity score. This is the group of schools that switched to CBT in 2017, and then their paper-based scores in the year before in 2016. So as shown in the previous graph, the schools with the low integrity scores scored very high on the paper-based exam, but now that they're doing the computer-based exam, they actually halved their average score. And you see that up to the threshold of 80, schools are dropping in their scores once they switch to the computer-based testing. And the schools that have a higher integrity score seem to have only a small difference between the scores, which kind of confirms this threshold that the government is using with, of 80, that above that, the schools are very unlikely to be cheating. So then I use the paper-based score and the integrity score and the interaction to predict the non-cheating exam score for the paper-based schools. And here you see just a simple regression of the computer-based score on these indicators, and they significantly predict the CBT score. And despite that we only have school level average exam scores, and we can only compare across cohorts of students, we reach an R-squared of 0.71 with this model, which means that the model explains 71% of the variation in the CBT scores, which is actually pretty high. So the model predicts fairly well. So using the paper-based score, the predicted score for the paper-based schools and the CBT score for the CBT schools, I can compare this computer exam score to the paper-based exam score. This is a simple comparison for all schools. So the school scored 57 on average on the paper-based exam, and then once they do it on a computer, they score about 48. So this suggested they increased their scores by about 18% of their non-cheating score, so to say. And what we can also do is now split this sample between into the cheating schools which have an integrity score below 70, and the high integrity schools which are above the 80 threshold. And we see clear differences in the drop-in scores here, as we would expect based on the correlation. So the low integrity schools actually drop with 23 points on their exam to a score of 46 on average, which is an increase of 49%. So this is very substantial. And then for the high integrity schools, it's only 3 points. Now, these high integrity schools are also dropping in score, but this could potentially be because these students still need to learn how to use the computer, or the items might be a bit different over the years in the exam. So for the low integrity schools, we cannot assume that this full drop is due to the cheating. So we take the difference between these scores and say, okay, well, so due to cheating, these cheating low integrity schools can increase their scores with 42%. So to conclude, well, cheating is substantial in Indonesia. 34% of the schools have low integrity according to this integrity score, and they increase their score with 42%. Now, there has been some other studies that looked at cheating with an integrity score in Western countries, so in Chicago and South Italy, and they found cheating in about 5% and 14% of the exams. So and as Abhijit also showed yesterday, in Indonesia and India, the problem is actually much larger. And when studying the learning crisis, it's very important to take this cheating into account. So so the national exam is not measuring learning, and students and teachers might not be putting as much effort into studying and teaching because they know that they can just cheat their way through. So in our future work, we will study this hypothesis and see if after implementation of the CBT, if schools are actually increasing their exam scores again, which should only be possible by studying harder and teaching better. So, thank you.
Hi everyone. Eduardo Masset from CEDU, and I'm going to talk about today the difficulty in generalizing evidence from impact evaluation studies of education interventions in international development. And in particular, I'm going to talk about one method which is used for generalizing evidence, which is meta-analyses. So these are examples of meta-analysis of education interventions. Meta-analysis is basically a quantitative summary of the evidence of interventions. And in a typical meta-analysis, you have a list of primary studies with a point estimates and confidence interval, and then you have a final summary statistics, which is the average of all the results from the primary studies. And the goal of a meta-analysis is to find out what works, right? To get some general conclusions about the effectiveness of an intervention. Now, as you know, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been exponential increase in impact evaluations in education. And at the same time, understandably, there's been an increase in systematic reviews of these primary studies. Now, one thing that has been observed about the systematic reviews and meta-analyses of education interventions is that they find different results in their conclusions, and sometimes even conflicting results. And that's been partly because the different reviews are using different samples of primary studies. They're not looking actually at the same studies. But I think that's only part of the explanation. The underlying reasons is because there is so much heterogeneity in the results of the studies that if the studies were homogeneous in results, taking different samples would not produce different results. So that's part of what I'm going to argue today. But before discussing this, I want to introduce a couple of misconceptions of what meta-analysis is. The first misconception is that meta-analyses are designed to identify a true, universal, general effect. This misconception is common, particularly among people who read the results of meta-analysis, not those that produce meta-analysis. Right? Those who produce meta-analysis have a second misconception. And the misconception is that the average summary statistics of meta-analysis is a prediction of what would be the impact of another intervention in the same area. To explain this misconception, I'm going to talk briefly about the two prevailing methods of meta-analysis that are being used, which is the fixed effects and random effects. So that relates to the misconception number one and misconception number two. So in a fixed effect meta-analysis, you start with the assumption that there is one general, true, universal effect that applies everywhere to everybody. Right? So different studies might have different sampling distribution, but they're estimating the same effect. And therefore, as you add more studies, as you produce more studies, the result is that your results, on average, on expectation, will converge to the real, true, universal mean. Now, this, of course, it can be true in some very special cases, but I think everybody would agree that it's very unlikely that will happen in a social intervention, definitely not in education. Right? We do have huge differences, which I summarize in three categories. One is differences in populations, so you can't expect the same intervention to have the same impact in all countries. There are differences in implementation. You can many times we label interventions like teacher training, but actually, when we look at what the project is, they're very different things. And then there are differences in the way the studies are conducted, the things are measured, and in the quality of the study. So there is a huge heterogeneity intervention. Everybody knows that, and that's why people nowadays use what is called a random effects meta-analysis. In a random effects meta-analysis, you don't believe there is a single universal true effect, but you believe that each study is an estimate of its own true effect for that particular intervention. So in a random effects meta-analysis, there are two elements of variability. One is the sampling variability, but the other one is the variability between studies. So you're trying to put together different results. Which means, so at that point, then what is the meaning of the average effect in this case? So clearly is not misconception number one. So the meta-analysis, the random effect meta-analysis does not find what works in general, right? So that's not the effect. And what it finds is actually nothing else than the average of the observed effects, right? So that's everything that random effects meta-analysis says. Now, that always comes at the same time with a confidence interval, which is actually measuring the accuracy of that mean. But it doesn't say anything about the dispersions of effects across different studies, the heterogeneity. In order to estimate that, we need something which is called prediction. interval that incorporates, in addition to the sampling variation, also the difference between studies. In other words, what happens is the prediction interval is a confidence interval which is much wider than the standard confidence interval. And the meaning of the prediction interval is representing the range of effects that you can expect a new intervention to have, provided it's similar to the intervention that you have in a meta-analysis. So it is actually a concept which is much closer to a view of using evidence for making decisions. And I'm going now to illustrate what difference it makes using confidence interval versus prediction intervals in education. And I've been using the data from what is probably the largest systematic review ever conducted in international development on education, which is a study by 3IE, which included 238 studies, 216 programs, and they were classified in 20 different intervention categories. And the authors used a random effect meta-analysis in the paper, and they used the confidence interval to test the hypothesis of whether intervention works or not. The conclusions are that when it comes to participation outcomes, cash transfer work, and that while school feeding is promising. And these are the only interventions that turn out to be effective. And when it comes to learning outcomes, the conclusion is that structured pedagogy is effective. There are a number of other interventions that are also promising. And that is based on, as I said, in confidence interval testing. Now I'm going to show what difference does it make to use confidence interval versus prediction intervals. So the chart here on the left are, these are meta-analyses. Each row is not a single study, but it's a meta-analysis with the estimate and the confidence interval. And you can see here the statistically significant result on cash transfers and school feeding. Now, when we're using prediction intervals rather than confidence intervals, we get much wider variation, and significance disappears. There is only one case, which is this one, where you still have a range of effect which is not crossing the zero line. But the reason is because there are only 3 studies in this category. So you cannot calculate the variance between studies because the number is too small. Of course, it also calls the question whether does it make sense to calculate an average of 2 studies or 3, and maybe they should be analyzed separately. It would be more informative. School completion, we got similar results. Again, tight confidence interval. We have some significant effects here. Here again, merit-based scholarship, but again, few studies, right? So we were unable to calculate the prediction interval, but you can see how. And also pay attention how large is the scale here. So we're going from minus 0.5 standard deviations to 1. So it's really, even if you look at the size, a very wide range of potential effects. These are the same on test score in mathematics. Again, you see here the tight confidence interval on pedagogy and merit-based scholarship that disappear when you look at a prediction interval. Same result for reading test scores, except for meta-analysis using very few studies. So in conclusion, what can we say about what works in education? Well, based on the charts using prediction intervals, I think you can't say that any intervention is predictably more effective than others, right? We can also say there is a huge heterogeneity of effects. Mine is my belief that this heterogeneity is actually underestimated. So there is more than it shows up here. And the reason is because in some cases, there are only a few studies for a given category, but those studies come often from the same country or from the same people. So if we were to expand the number of studies for that category, we will have even more heterogeneity. There is also an issue of publication bias, where it's not just that it's the same people doing the same work in the same countries, but it's also that positive results and tends to be published. Right, and so we are actually, there is a meta-analysis is not a random sample of all possible studies, but it's actually part of the production of knowledge and the use of knowledge. And certainly the process of producing knowledge operates to decrease heterogeneity, to make studies more homogeneous, to look much more alike each other. Is there anything that could be done to improve this? Well, I don't think one obvious thing that you said, well, you should conduct more studies. But that's unlikely to work. I mean, because having more studies will not reduce the heterogeneity in effects. So it can make your mean can be more accurately estimated, but the heterogeneity will still be there. I think one improvement could be in redefining intervention categories. I mean, there are things, for example, in the systematic reviews or meta-analysis that people do, and where they say teacher training or even cash transfer, they actually mean very different things. So the projects are very, very different from each other. So there is one way of reducing heterogeneity there by redefining more narrowly the categories and conducting more studies for that particular programs. Finally, the one question could be, is it worth doing a meta-analysis at all? And I think the answer, well, you may be surprised, but I think the answer is yes. I think it's actually a very useful exercise, provided you interpret the results correctly. So there is lots of useful information here. And in fact, the goal, but remember, is a misconception. The goal of a random effects meta-analysis is not to find out what is the general effect, what works. It's actually the beginning of starting exploring the heterogeneity of effects, because the assumption is that effects are heterogeneous. And so a meta-analysis should be the starting point to understand why interventions have different results in different places and for different people, and when they're conducted differently. So the answer is yes. I think meta-analysis is still useful. And the final comments for conducting single studies. As I said, there's been a lot of evaluations in the last 15 years, particularly in the form of randomized controlled trials. Now, you should bear in mind that when you do a straight RCT, what it's doing is actually providing a data point for a meta-analysis. That's the ultimate goal of an RCT. And you have to ask yourself whether it's valuable exercise in education, for example. This is not to say that we shouldn't do RCT, no, not at all. But at the same time, we should think when we conduct primary studies to do it in such a way that we also bring an understanding of the mechanism of the intervention, which can be a different way of generalizing. But if the goal is saying what works, is not necessarily the right way to do it. Thank you. All right. One more or two more? All right.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes, so we'll take questions. I think it's worked reasonably well. We focus on one part of the room and then we move on. So we'll start over here. One at the front there, one there, and one there. Okay, so if you could say your name as you ask your question.
Sure, thanks. Is this on? My name's Bronwyn. I first just to thank all the speakers. Really interesting set of presentations. I have a question for Emily in terms of the cheating study. So to what extent can we say that the high stakes testing form itself is sort of at the root cause of cheating by creating sort of perverse incentives for teaching and learning? And then that is a more broader question on whether it's troubling at all to equate learning with the results on these high stake tests.
Hi, Barbara Mensch. I have a question for Eduardo. As one who does systematic reviews and meta-analysis and finds it often frustrating, what about in terms of reducing heterogeneity to encourage duplication of studies for RCTs, to do exactly the same study multiple times? Wouldn't that help our cause? It certainly would help the analyst who's doing the systematic review, who has to deal with the heterogeneity. And this is, in a sense, a call out to donors that maybe we need duplication as best as we can, even though we know context will differ.
One more. Oh, okay. We'll just stick to that side. Take the question at the back, and then we'll come on to the middle side.
My name is Anton de Graube. I thought that last presentation indeed particularly useful, but at the same time, it does not really surprise me. And I'm not sure you're going to solve the problem by having more homogeneous strategies, let's say. I think the reason why you have the diversity is because the same strategy is implemented in very different contexts. And it just doesn't work in very different contexts. We all know that school autonomy works in some cases where you have a strong head teacher, supportive community, and so on, while it doesn't work in other cases. So I think where we can get, and the fact that there is such diversity is not surprising because the contexts are so very diverse. And so the real challenge is to find the right strategy for the right context. And I'm not sure that whatever RCTs and so on we're going to use will be very useful as long as we don't emphasize the importance of the context.
Okay, let's take those. So Eduardo, a question on is it all diverse? Is it all driven by context? And what about replication?
Yeah. So starting from the last one, and of course, definitely 100% agree with what you said, and take it as more like a comment rather than a question. So it's definitely. There is so much of which is driven by context. So that's the whole point of talking about heterogeneity of results. Whether that can be picked up by a randomized controlled trial or not, it depends. I mean, you can design a primary study in such a way to, if not understanding heterogeneity, at least to explore how the mechanism works. For the other question about replicating studies, I think that's definitely very interesting to exercise. But I see it more like a type of study for understanding. Well, there is an interest in confirming the results, right? Whether actually. There are some studies finding very amazing results that, of course, do not replicate, but just because it was a random chance event. But I think in the case of education, where you know already there is a lot of heterogeneity, I think I would be more interested to look at different studies rather than replication of single studies.
Okay, Emily, high stakes, is that what's behind cheating?
Yeah, so thank you for your questions. This is, I think, a very important question that is still very much up for debate, and it speaks a lot to the discussion that Derek Neal started on, when you're measuring like two different things with the same test, then it kind of induces cheating. So in this case, it would be student learning and school quality, so that kind of everyone in the system has incentives to cheat. I think that high stakes, so it could be a problem, but there are ways around it. So for example, with the computer-based testing, it seems to be working and no one else or so far, no one has really found a way to cheat on it yet. And well, as long as you, yeah, I wouldn't know how to, but there's probably some smart people that can. So I believe that even though it is a high stakes test, it does measure learning at the moment. But the Indonesian government is actually also lowering the stakes for the students on the exam. So it's no longer a requirement for graduation, for example, because they are very motivated to make the national exam a measurement for learning and not for other disruptions in there. So I don't have like a clear answer to this question, but I think it is a very important debate that should be ongoing.
Okay, great. Let's take 3 more from the middle section. So there. I'll come to you maybe at the next one, okay?
Hi, my name is Lisa Chen, and my first question is for Melissa. Melissa, I was really interested in looking at your distribution of full coherency, and I was wondering if there's anything we can take away from the distribution, not just the mean. I saw some wide variation, and how does that affect your thinking about potentially targeting policy interventions at different levels of bureaucracy? Does it tell us anything about the cost of doing business, for example, in different contexts? And then for Emily,
I think we'll stick to one question each because there's many people asking questions. Okay.
Hi, Nick Spoor from South Africa. The question's for Noam, and it's about the kind of psychometrics that's linked to the equating process. So as I understand it, 48 of these 160 plus countries, are you taking EGRA data, so these are grade 2 students, and equating this trying to create a cardinal measure, not just an ordinal measure, that also then equates things like PISA, TIMSS, SACMEC, PEARLS. And so the question is there risk in not just doing an academic exercise, but almost similar to the Justin's doing business drama that he had with the World Bank, similar to creating a metric that starts getting used for things like the Human Capital Index? And do you not have reservations about this kind of equating EGRA and PISA and thinking that that's not extremely suspicious? Thanks.
Okay, I think there was one. Okay, great.
Hi, Idalia Rodriguez. My question is also for Noah. It's in the same way of equating and also in sense of sampling. Some of the sources you mentioned, they're usually not nationally representative, and now you're giving an extra step comparing countries. So if you could give more about the methods you used in psychometrics and sampling about that. Thanks.
Okay, great. So Ned, do you want to take the questions on sampling and equating?
Sure. They're great questions, thank you. I would say, so a few things. So one is in the data, it actually makes really clear what's happening. So I would say, let me kind of take the nationally representative. All of the regional assessments and international assessments are nationally representative. There are, I believe, 31 of the EGRA countries are also nationally representative. So there is a large, most of the data is nationally representative, and that's kind of a core thing for this all to work, as you highlight. There is a subset of countries that do not have nationally representative data, and that's kind of very clearly asterisked and kind of made clear. That's similar actually to PISA and these other assessments, which often will have a few countries where that's not the case, and then they'll make that clear. The idea of including those countries is sometimes some data is better than no data. We could have a debate about whether that's true, but at least it's transparent and clear which is which. So that's kind of to that piece. In terms of the EGRA inclusion, so the EGRA inclusion, there's a lot of kind of details that go into getting it to be reasonable and make it make sense. Certainly it's not trivial, and there's a lot of debate about how to do that in a good way. One thing is with EGRA, it's not item response theory. So the underlying assessment, there's sort of some pieces there. But in terms of the kind of equating to PISA, so because it's subject specific and level specific, the EGRA data is related to the primary school scores. So it's before you aggregate, and when it's disaggregated, it's looking at primary and reading specifically. So all of the linking is done within subject and within level to make sure it's the right proficiency and that there's proficiency overlap. So even though you don't get item, there is a proficiency overlap, and that's really, really important. In addition, for EGRA, as folks who are familiar with EGRA might know, there's different subtasks. And so actually for EGRA specifically, we're looking at reading comprehension, which is the closest thing that's conceptually similar to what's used on some of the regional assessments, where there's also sort of a reading comprehension component. And so a lot of work is done to make sure that those speak to each other within the right level, within the right subject, and even within that, within the right proficiency. And we do a gazillion robustness tests to make sure we're getting something that ends up making sense. But happy to chat more about the EGRA inclusion.
Okay, Melissa, on the distribution of coherence.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really interesting point. So what I showed you with the regression results very quickly was at the school level. We also looked at it sort of by that local administrative level across countries, and you see the same correlation at that sort of municipality or whatever the local administrative district is. And so I think we need to think more about that. I think the very simple takeaway for us, at least, is that looking above the school level matters a lot. And I think this relates. Multiple people made related points yesterday, including Ben, around kind of what level you randomize your intervention. And I think that's very important. I think we need to think more about if there are any other implications that we could draw out from what we see in the distribution.
Okay, great. So we'll take one last question from the middle section at the back. One question there, one question there. Okay, I'll take the first question is at the back in the middle section. Okay. And then here.
Hi, I'm Beda from ITSR Pakistan and PAL Network. My question, since we can only ask one question to Noam. So in that larger global discourse on the global learning indicator, the bank has decided to launch the HCI. The question is that looking at SDG 4.1.1a, the lower primary, are we getting away from really raising the bar on learning? Or, I mean, even though we are coming from the PAL network doing lower primary, but I'm just wondering in that larger discourse, where does this all sit? And a related question is, so far in terms of the takers of HCI, where's it pitched at? The Ministries of Finance or Ministries of Education? So I don't think in the Ministries of Education we are seeing a lot of stir.
Okay. Over to this side.
Thank you. I'm Joe DiStefano from RTI. My question's for Melissa about the study you did on coherence or incoherence. I'm thinking of Brian Levy's presentation yesterday where he talked about high degrees of coherence but that aren't aligned to learning. So you have bureaucratic coherence and a low-level performance trap, as he referred to it. And if you looked at anything besides de jure and de facto coherence and whether any of it had anything to do with what we would consider factors that would impact learning.
Okay. One here, and then we'll take one more to finish up.
Hello, Alex Ionesto from CGD. It's a question for Noam. Did you include the new PISA-D result in the database? And how are you going to do with the update in the future in terms of if you have a new update, then you might have a new linking rate. So are you going to change back the result of the countries? Is it going to change the STI? Is it an issue for you?
Yeah.
Hi. This is a question for Eduardo. My name is Asif Naiman. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. Eduardo, in your opinion, as you said that education interventions are maybe not as amenable to meta-analyses as other sectors, within those sort of subsets of interventions, do you think there are those that are more amenable to meta-analyses than others within education?
Okay, great. Eduardo, that seems a fairly succinct question. So do you want to start with that one and then we'll work back?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very nice question. I think that the question really touches the point of addressing heterogeneity. So one of the first things you could do in a meta-analysis of this kind is to see what interventions. I can't see the person asking the question. All right, here, there. Yes, the first thing you could do is actually looking at how different across intervention categories is the expected range of impact, right? So as you said, in some cases, actually, the prediction interval can be actually very narrow. And that's interesting in its own, right? So I think it's probably something you will have to look at the data more carefully. but is certainly one thing to explore, together with redefining the categories as well. So I think if I understand, the goal is to have a more homogeneous sample of intervention where generalization is possible. Yeah, I think it would be a good way to proceed.
Noam, a very specific question on PISA-D, and then what's the bigger picture linking to the global debate?
Yeah, definitely. So on PISA-D, that was not yet out when we finalized the data, so it wasn't included, but now it obviously is there, and so it will be included in the next update. Just a note on that, I think kind of distinguishing between the various sources of variation is important. So PISA is older students. A lot of the data for the same countries was coming from primary school. And so we wouldn't just looking at those, that is important. I think one of the nice features of this database is it does disaggregate by that, so you can get a sense of where that's coming from versus kind of linking differences versus subject versus level. So I think that's important. In terms of, and then there was
I was going to say just the updates. I'm interested in that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So it's in terms of kind of how the is the exchange rate fixed and how that will look in the future. So certainly that's going to be tackled. And so there's ongoing conversations on the exact specifics of sort of which time intervals to fix it to. But like other indicators, there do need to be kind of updated and then rebasing essentially. So that will need to be a part of it. Yeah. On the SDG 4.1.1a, very specific. It's a great point. We hope that these are both kind of speaking to the same agenda, which is putting learning at the center and also drawing attention to learning in early grades, which the HCI version of learning is aggregated, but it includes early grades. There's a few differences, so certain assessments are included in one and not the other, so I think over time, hopefully those can kind of speak more to each other over time. And then there's also thresholds versus mean scores. So there's sort of conversations around that, but certainly speaking to kind of the broader goal in a similar way, but slightly different permutations. But I know that that's a conversation that's ongoing. On the piece of kind of which ministries are being engaged with, I might punt that to Penny for the afternoon. I don't know if that's going to be covered, but that's sort of on the rollout beyond the kind of construction of the index and kind of the human capital project. So I will defer that to others to speak to, but certainly it's a large effort, and I know there's a lot of conversation and kind of pieces thinking about how to maximize traction of the index in country.
And Melissa, on the coherence possibly around functions and tasks not aligned to learning?
Yeah, to Joe's point, so thank you for bringing that up, Joe. I think I saw Brian's presentation yesterday and was excited to see him say that he thought that this didn't matter because it's good to have some debate around this. I think to me, I haven't read the book, and so it's hard for me to say exactly sort of what he's looking at and how closely it matches up to what we're looking at. But my initial thought is really that, compliance and coherence matters depending on the processes that you're talking about. And so obviously sort of process compliance with, pushing pieces of paper around or whatever we sort of think as meaningless, bureaucratic activities that we do. Yeah, I don't think that those would matter either. I think we started from the point of saying, okay, well, there are sort of core functions to making sure that the right inputs end up in schools. And so that's what we're looking at in terms of processes and compliance. So things like actually measuring student learning, getting personnel management right, which we think is super important. So I think that there's, baked into the approach that we used is a focus on specific functions that we think would matter. And so I think that that's where we came from with it. And something we haven't done, we've thought about, but it seems a little bit arbitrary to us, is to look at sort of individual functions and whether some seem to be more correlated with learning or not. But that's something that we've talked about before. And if you have views, it would be great to talk about it.
Okay, great. We're pretty much on time, so I'll just very briefly sum up. For me, I think the first three speakers, it was very optimistic. It told us that there were things that were possible in terms of methods and measurements. It's possible to get a sense of coherence within the education bureaucracy. And the startling fact, something like 50% of tasks are correctly, people perceive that they correctly have their tasks, only 50% of the tasks. For Noam, it's possible to get a sense of a global learning indicator, and a startling factor around the flipping of the gender gap. I think that was very interesting to see. And for Emily, it's possible to get a handle on cheating in schools in Indonesia, and a striking difference between the data in Indonesia and in the US and Italy. 34% of schools found to be cheating and inflating scores by up to 42%. Quite remarkable. Eduardo, I noted more a sense of caution and a challenge to us that when thinking about undertaking studies, as many of us are, and reporting on over these 2 days, to think more about mechanisms if we're going to feed these in ultimately to meta-studies. So thanks everyone for a thought-provoking morning on methods and measurement.
I'm based in Pakistan. I do IT in Pakistan. I work with them. We're part of this. The PAL network. Yes. I think so. Or maybe later this afternoon. I'm not sure. She's in US somewhere, and she will appear.
All right. Whoa. Welcome back, everybody. Okay. You're not going to not hear me. Okay, so this is our next session is on the topic of human resources, and particularly we're talking about schools, so we're talking about teachers. I distinctly remember 4 years ago at the first RISE conference, a little bit of a fight breaking out, not a physical fight, but Norbert Shady was up here presenting his work that many of you know, Araujo et al. Ecuador paper on teacher effects and how much teacher quality matters, and that some teachers are much better than others, and we need to find out how to identify those teachers and get more of those teachers. And Derek Neal was in the audience and was not having it, that there is no such thing as teacher quality in the abstract, and that it is the incentive system in which those teachers work that determines their quality, and that's what we need to be focused on. I don't think we resolved that day, but it was quite instructive. Moving through the kind of the history of the RISE program, in 2016 we had Tessa Bull talking about all the results of the SDI framework, surveys rather, and Dion I see is here, and lots of SDI team members. What do teachers know and what do they do? With some fairly depressing results about teacher knowledge in Africa. And then in 2017, we had Menno Pradhan present this paper from Indonesia with Karthik and others who were here, this double for nothing, doubling teacher pay in Indonesia, generating no improvements in learning levels, but kind of leaving open some glimmer of hope there about the extensive margin. This was for existing teachers, so maybe if we could pay more and get new, better teachers into the system, that would work. 2018, last year, we really came back to this teacher quality versus incentives thing head on with 2 randomized trials of pay for performance for teachers. One, Derek Neal was back with results from Uganda, and Noreen Karachiwala, who I think maybe here, presented their results from pay for performance, which were, I want to say, kind of mixed on the effectiveness of pay for percentile in Uganda. And Yudi Schipper presented the paper from Tanzania with results that maybe simpler versions of pay for performance in Tanzania performed relatively well and even better than the more sophisticated versions. And so today we're going to take up some of those same themes. We've got Svetlana Sabarwal, who's going to talk about, again, back in Tanzania, should we be paying teachers for learning outcomes, or should we be motivating students with incentives for learning outcomes? And Andy Zeitlin's going to present results from Rwanda that look both at this motivation margin with incentives and this selection margin of does paying teachers differently attract a different kind of teacher into the system, and which of these margins should we work on? But we've also had in the kind of the history of RISE a focus on, to not just motivating and hiring and firing teachers. Fei Yuan presented results last year about the working conditions that teachers face in developing countries. And we've had a number of papers on coaching, both South Africa and Brazil. And so we're going to kick off this session with Farwa Fatima from the University of Pennsylvania, kind of talking about, this kind of burnout and motivation of teachers, because we know that, in a lot of school systems, going all the way back to kind of the Steger and Rokoff searching for effective teachers literature, the teacher turnover and losing young teachers is a really high cost issue for many school systems. And then finally, we're going to hear from Torsten Figueiredo, who's going to talk about kind of the misallocation approach. Economists in the room are familiar with kind of the misallocation of capital, and Torsten's going to talk to us about the misallocation of human resources across schools. So, as I said, a long history of this theme on human resources in the RISE program, and it's nice to see it continue, I think, moving forward as we go along. So without further ado, let's turn over to Farwa first to talk to us about working conditions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Farwa, and I'm a doctoral student at University of Pennsylvania. This work I'm presenting, I've been doing with Dr. Sharon Wolf at the Graduate School of Education, and we're basically looking at risks that new teachers face, particularly during their student teaching year when they're part of in pre-service training, and then when they transition into full-time teaching positions during their first and second years of teaching. So we're going to be using data from rural Ghana. And I'm sure everybody's now familiar with the context of Ghana after yesterday's talk with Dr. Tando. So just quickly, everybody knows all about Sustainable Development Goals, but SDG 4C in particular focuses on increasing the supply of qualified teachers through appropriate and relevant in-service and pre-service training workshops. There are also some recent estimates by UNESCO that say that countries around the world must recruit 68.8 million new teachers in the next 14 years to achieve the goals of SDG 4. Now, the real challenge right now is for these countries to retain these new teachers in the system. And so this slide I shouldn't really need to go over, but very quickly, for those who weren't there yesterday for the last session, Ghana, we know, is a lower middle income country in West Africa, right here. It ranks 140 out of 189 countries on the HDI, and according to a recent World Bank report, the number of quality-adjusted learning years is 5.7 out of the average 11.6 years of schooling. So this means that children are in school, but they're not learning for nearly 6 years. And this low learning is identified to be a result of a number of challenges that were also talked about. To do with poor infrastructure, ineffective teacher management, ineffective use of the non-salary budget, and lack of accountability. Particularly with ineffective teacher management, we've seen that it often translates into ineffective teacher deployment, lack of administrative support, and which eventually does lead to sometimes teacher absenteeism and in extreme cases, teacher attrition. We've also seen in literature that the motivation of teachers, there's a strong relationship between motivation and teacher retention, teacher attrition. So we've seen in literature that motivation of new teachers is also reported to be chronically low in Ghana in particular. There have been a lot of studies, but in particular, a study by Akyempong and Lewin in 2002 looked at teachers in their first year, so new teachers, and they were asked to speculate about their teaching career in the next 5 years, and only 3% of the teachers said that they would still be in the system teaching. So with all of that, we have a guiding conceptual model here. So Literature, again, we've seen in literature that new teachers in particular face a host of risks. So from personal circumstances to do with physical health, family and social commitments, to professional working conditions, which range from poor salaries, student discipline problems, lack of administrative support, as we've talked before, and just being excluded from and not having ownership in decision-making processes. So we think that these set of risks interact with each other, come together to affect or influence the way teachers feel. And we're talking about well-being here, which can be understood as a set of constructs that range from, that in the literature have been identified by motivation of teachers, the burnout levels, their job satisfaction, personal accomplishment, and again, there is literature that shows that these constructs kind of translate into and are related to teacher performance, to socio-emotional adjustment and learning of students, and again, as we've seen, teacher attrition and retention. So with this conceptual model in place, our current study is asking three questions. So do personal and professional risks experienced by student teachers while they're in pre-service training predict their professional well-being? Whether the personal and professional risks of newly qualified teachers predict teachers' professional well-being and student outcomes at the end of the first year of full-time teaching, and whether personal and professional risks of newly qualified teachers predict teacher retention at the end of the first 2 years of full-time teaching. So the data that we have here is coming from the western region of Ghana, from Tekoradai. And we assessed 135 student teachers at the end of their student teaching year. They're coming from the Holy Child College of Education. And so this was in June 2016. And by the start of the coming academic school year, by October 2016, all these student teachers had been placed as newly qualified teachers in 117 schools across 8 regions in Ghana. And these regions ranged from some in Ashanti, some in Brong, Ahafo, a few in Central, a few in Eastern, 1 or 2 up there in Northern and Upper Eastern regions, but most of them, about 81, were in the Western region right here. And then in June 2017, which is the end of the first year of full-time teaching, we have 131, so 4 teachers at TRIT. 131 of these 135 newly qualified teachers were assessed at the end of their first year of full-time teaching. And at the same time, a random sample of children, 15 children per teacher were assessed in the teacher's class. So we have, and we also got their baseline data at the time of placement in October 2016. And then, again, in June 2018, so 2 years after, so at the end of the second year of full-time teaching, those teachers are assessed again. And then we have about 121, so another 10 teachers are TRIT by the second year. So with that data, and these teachers are primarily placed in early childhood education settings. A few of them were placed in primary education, primary classes, when they should have been placed in early childhood education classes, in pre-primary classes. So we're using a cumulative risk approach because we've seen how new teachers face a set of multiple and interrelated risks, and just focusing on a singular risk factor such as the social isolation they feel would be placing emphasis on, or it would be emphasizing the importance of individual risk too much. So these multiple indicators of personal and professional challenges are operationalized as cumulative risk indices. So this next these tables here, so this first table here is showing the domains that we looked at to come up with the personal cumulative risk index. So we have household hardship, health and well-being, social isolation. So the number of people living in your household are greater than 5. If you're experiencing food insecurity issues, if you don't have any family or friends in the community where you're deployed and where you're teaching, then we have for professional risk domains, we have objective working conditions, the amount of time that you spend on administrative tasks, on maintaining order in class, or the actual time spent on teaching. And then in terms of subjective work conditions, the quality of supervision, if it's poor, and poor parental support and involvement. So we see that while in their student teaching year and when they start start teaching as full-time teachers, there is a fair majority of student teachers and newly qualified teachers are experiencing social isolation. So we have high percentages here. And then we also see that a lot of them, about 44, when they're student teachers, and about 30% of the newly qualified teachers spend greater than 25% of their time on maintaining order in classes. And then we also see that they're experiencing poor parental support and involvement, which is interesting because yesterday Dr. Tando was mentioning that at tertiary education level, they tend to experience a lot of parental support, but perhaps in early childhood education settings, they do not, and that's why the teachers are struggling with these kind of challenges. So we're using a basic OLS regression model. We're controlling for teacher characteristics, and when we look at teachers when they are placed in schools, we control for school level characteristics and region fixed effects because there are large disparities between regions. And then we also, when we're looking at student level outcomes, we account for clustering of students within teachers and schools. So here are some results. So these are correlational estimates. So we see that professional cumulative risk, an additional unit or an additional professional cumulative risk, so we've seen there are different indicators for that, are correlated with about 0.16. So it predicts lower motivation and lower personal accomplishment by about 0.16 standard deviations, about 0.15 to 0.16 standard deviations. And personal cumulative risk predicts higher burnout by about 0.17 standard deviations. And when they become full-time teachers, we see that personal cumulative risk is no longer predicting any of the well-being outcomes, but professional cumulative risk is predicting higher burnout and lower personal accomplishment by about 0.1415 standard deviations. So this is in terms of their well-being. When we look at the relationship between cumulative risk and student learning, and student learning here is measured using IDELA, the tool that has been developed by Save the Children. There are people from Save the Children here, so they're very happy by Save the Children and NYU. So here we see very marginal relationship correlation. So an additional unit of personal cumulative risk is predicting lower numeracy by about 0.04 and lower executive functioning by about 0.06. And professional is predicting lower socio-emotional skills by about 0.005. So there is some relationship between cumulative risk and student learning, although the magnitude of these coefficients aren't particularly high. But we see something. So what can we say? Is cumulative risk predicting student learning or not? And in terms of its relationship with teacher retention, we saw that there was no significant association with teacher retention at the end of the second year of full-time teaching. Now, we didn't have data for third or fourth year. It would be, there's literature that shows that teachers tend to attrit more at the end of the first 3 years, and particularly more at the end of the 5 years. So if we do have enough data, we could follow up to see if retention does become significantly associated with cumulative risk at those time points. So what we've seen is, and here a lot of the things that I'm going to go over are already being implemented in the new reforms that were discussed yesterday. So that is great. But still, there are some recommendations which are new, which weren't there. So they're worth sharing with the ministry. So well-structured and integrated training programs, and so there is literature that shows that the more integrated the programs are, especially if they're in cohorts, they're very beneficial for student teachers, as it allows them to manage household responsibilities and at the same time engage in meaningful relationships with their peers and with their students. So it kind of helps address the set of personal and professional risks that they're experiencing during that year. And then especially when they transition to full-time teaching positions, deployment systems that place these newly qualified teachers, particularly young women, if they could place them in rural communities near family, or place 2 new qualified teachers together in the same school, could also help teachers settle in difficult locations. Yesterday, Dr. Tando did mention that they have a few interventions, they have a few reforms that are to do with the deployment systems in a way to help them settle down in these new rural communities where they're allowed to sort of go through a year-long program in the community where they would be eventually teaching, which helps them get familiarized with the context, and it allows the transition to be easier. He also mentioned that there is the option for teachers to choose after 3 years to move to a different rural community or locality, which is also helpful to help them settle in the first place. But again, this could also be another thing to consider. Then work environments that offer constructive mentorship and strong support systems also positively relate to teacher well-being, and this could also be translated as coming from strong leadership at schools. And these recommendations in general are thought to be helpful to help student teachers, particularly as they transition into full-time teaching positions, to settle down and be retained, hopefully first to improve their well-being and hopefully influence student learning, and if you have enough data to see if they would also be retained in the education systems. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Svetlana. I work at the World Bank. So I'll be talking about what is it that we should really be expecting from teacher incentives, right? And this is joint work that I did with Dion Filmer and James Habirimana in Tanzanian secondary schools, so grade 10 students and teachers between 2012 and 2016. And I asked myself, is this just a clickbaity way to say what were the impacts of teacher incentives in secondary schools in Tanzania? Well, then I said, okay, I do want to think through what these results and maybe some other results mean for education systems, and what do they mean for how we should talk to policymakers about them. And also that if I think this is clickbait, then there is something I have other bigger problems. Okay, so in Tanzania, like in many other developing countries, the share of teachers who should be in class but are not is relatively high. And the share of class time that is being spent on teaching activities or learning activities is relatively low. And when we look at these numbers, we think, okay, what is the way to improve teacher effort, right? Teacher effort needs to be improved. And unfortunately, when it comes to options to improve teacher effort in the very short run, right? So tomorrow, we don't have very many options at hand. And the one thing that keeps on coming up again and again is the idea of imposing these sort of extrinsic incentives which tie some type of reward to student learning typically, right? And the reason these are popular is because they are relatively easy to implement. So you test students, you announce some type of reward, you test students again, you see what type of, you then reward the teachers who've done well, and then you move on, right? So these are not logistically or politically or technically, they're not very hard to implement. And that's one of the reasons why they've been studied quite a bit. The problem is that even though we've studied them quite a bit, we still haven't figured out whether these incentives will make a typical teacher feel like this, you know, I'm being acknowledged, I'm being respected, or will it make a typical teacher feel like this, right? Oh, what fresh hell is this? So you see this in the way some of these outcomes show up, right? Now, the good news is that by and large, we find that in developing country contexts where teacher pay and teacher compensation packages are not very high, these incentives don't lead to negative impacts as they do in a lot of places in the United States. Still, there is this big variation, and the big sort of reveal from all this literature is that the effectiveness of these programs depends on their design. And the first time I saw this, it really blew my mind. I'm only joking. So the question is, what's the right design, right? So when me and my co-authors started to think about this in the context of Tanzania, we decided to test that version of the teacher incentive program that is most likely to be implemented, right? That could actually be implemented tomorrow. And to find this magical design, we talked to policymakers, who then in turn asked us 4 questions, okay? And I want to spend a minute or two on these questions because I think it's useful to think through them systematically. So the first question is, okay, if I introduce teacher incentives in the system, and then for some reason, most probably because I run out of money, I have to discontinue them, what will happen to teacher performance and teacher morale, right? And implicit in this question is this idea that teacher incentives are like cocaine, right? Once you've been exposed to them, you are going to want them and you're going to expect them, and if you don't get them, you're going to refuse to do your job. So this fear that they are going to be very hard to discontinue was a big fear. The second big fear is what's going to happen to weaker schools. So here, the policymakers had a very simple articulation to say, look, incentives are well and good for those who can and those who do. But they're completely useless for those who cannot and those who will not, right? And those are the people that really need the most help, right? So the most sort of non-performing, not well-performing, not high-quality teachers are not going to really respond to these incentives. You know, as Homer Simpson says, trying is just the first step to failure. So what is the point? Now, these were the big fears, right, 1 and 2. And once we talked the policymakers beyond the big fear, basically by promising to look into these questions and study them very seriously, we come to the negotiation stage, at which stage the first question is how to make them cheap, okay? They need to be very, very cheap. But they also need to be very, very attractive. So the reason is not only because the policymaker wants them to be meaningful, right, to create some learning impacts, I'm sure it's on their minds, but they also want it to be politically attractive. They want teachers to be happy with these incentive programs, not upset. So how do you think about a cheap but attractive program, right? So the answer that we came up with after a lot of discussion and talking and thinking is to do this in a way that's medium stakes. Okay? Now, it's very unfortunate that it sounds like something you'd order in a restaurant, but it's a serious proposal. And usually we've talked a lot about high stakes and we've talked about low stakes, but maybe not enough about medium stakes. So what do these mean? So in order to make it cheap, the thing to do is to design it as a tournament, right? And fortunately, this also aligns with the received wisdom from these incentive studies that a tournament is maybe better than a threshold style incentive. And it makes it cheap because you're reaching a large number of teachers who are competing with each other, schools are competing with each other, but you only have to award 1 or 2 or 3. The second thing you do is you emphasize the prestige component. This is also Incentives 101. If a part of your gap is that the teacher who's really putting in effort for student learning is not feeling acknowledged and appreciated, then you do a big public ceremony, which is what we did, have some type of public official give them the award. And emphasizing prestige is relatively less costly than doing big awards. And then you can't just rely on prestige, right? This is what differentiates this from low stakes. If it's only prestige, it often ends up being somewhat low stakes. But the policymakers were willing to let us use in-kind transfers. They were completely uninterested in cash. This I have experienced again and again in multiple contexts, because they worry that cash is hard to discontinue. So in-kind prices they were still okay with. So how to make them attractive? So this has 2 big components. The first component is that most of the teachers that you are targeting should feel like they have some shot at winning, a reasonable, non-trivial shot at winning. So the way you do this is, again, 101, you base it on improvement, first of all, not on levels. But then you also design your tournament in such a way that students with similar type students, teachers with similar type students are competing with teachers of the same type, right? And the way we did this was we broke our sample into groups of 25 schools where the schools were close enough to each other, but also had similar baseline student scores. And then when we communicated the teacher incentive scheme, we told the teachers, look, this is the school that you will be, these are the schools that you will be competing with. The second thing to make it attractive is to make the prize meaningful. And here we had lots of very interesting conversations with teachers, and we found that what they wanted were these cool cell phones, okay? And the cool cell phones make sense because they're used widely, they're a status symbol, and they're very liquid, very easy to convert them to cash. So this is what we did, and this is how we designed the study. Now, unfortunately, Justin emphasized the one part of the study that I'm not going to talk about, which is we also looked at student incentives versus teacher incentives. 15 minutes, I thought, okay, best not be greedy. But I'll just tell you that the big headline message is, by and large, we found teacher incentives to be much more effective than student incentives. But what we did is we introduced these teacher incentives in a bunch of schools in 2013. And then in 2014, we re-randomized these schools into a group that received the incentives again, so teacher incentives repeated, and a group where the teacher incentives were withdrawn. Okay? And here we did a lot of communication to teachers saying, look, you had the incentive program last year, you're not going to have it this year, and it's very unlikely that you're going to have it again. And these are the results, the end of phase 2, 2014, that I'll mostly be talking about. And then we again visited these schools at the end of 2015. So you can imagine, by the end of 2014, we had these schools which had incentives for 2 years, these schools which had incentives for 1 year and 1 year without. And then at the end of 2015, we had these schools with incentives for 2 years and 1 year without, and these schools with incentives for 1 year and 2 years without. Easy peasy. So the big message is that these incentives seem to lead to improvements in learning, right? And by and large, these improvements are comparing favorably with what we've seen in other studies, including the study in Tanzania primary schools. So this is in secondary, in primary schools. So medium stakes seem to be okay. They seem to be working just as well as a lot of the other studies. Now, what about the big fear, right? So when we withdraw these incentives, so at end line, end of 2014, we see that, the impacts say more or less positive. They're not statistically significant anymore, but no evidence of this, like these withdrawal symptoms. And then we don't see that again 1 year after end line. We see again they're sort of more or less positive. And in fact, in the repeated group, there is some evidence of sort of stickiness, right, that they continue to be positive and significant. So what happens to weaker schools? So one very crude way to look at this question is to compare what happens in public schools with private schools, okay? And private school incidence in Tanzania, especially at the secondary level, is not very high. So there are few secondary private schools for historic reasons. And even after we oversample them, we only had about 20% of our sample being private. And they do somewhat better than public schools at baseline. So not dramatically better, somewhat better, just on the margin of being statistically significant. And what we find is, at end line, we see positive impacts in both public and private. In fact, public impacts for English are stronger. But 1 year after end line, we see that actually most of these impacts are sticking around in private schools. And even after withdrawal, the impacts in private schools are fairly strong, right? And not just this, the way the teachers are responding is very different. So in public schools, this is at end line, the improved performance is seen mostly in the mid to high ability students, right? But in private schools, most of the improvement is seen in the low to mid ability students. And this is after we control. So we're controlling, so this is diff and diff. We're also controlling for the private school dummy, and we're also controlling for the school baseline average, okay? And this is the interaction effect. So what's going on here? We're not sure. We're investigating further, but it just seems that private school teachers have more confidence in targeting their weakest students than public school teachers do, who target their better ability students. Okay, wait. Oh, what happened? I can't go back? Oh, sorry. All right, okay, wait. So we also wanted to look at impact heterogeneity more broadly, and we didn't have a pre-analysis plan. So we decided to use machine learning to look at where are we seeing these significant differences in treatment. And we used the Athey and Imbin's causal forest algorithm to do this. And I use the word we very loosely. I had nothing to do with it. James did everything. So ask him all the questions. But basically, this is a very cool way, because what it does is it lets the machine tell you where the differences, where the heterogeneity is significant and meaningful. And then when you do it one time, you create what's called a causal tree. But when you do it repeatedly, we did it 20,000 times, you get a causal forest. And once you have that causal forest, you pick out the variables that show up consistently as being predictive of significant differences in treatment. And the one variable that kept showing up again and again and again is the school baseline performance, okay? So schools that met certain performance thresholds responded much better, much more positively and significantly to these incentives than schools that didn't meet that performance threshold. And so this basically bears out the intuition of the policymaker, which is that if you are looking at these really weak schools or really weak teachers, they're not going to respond to these incentives. Okay, so what's the big takeaway? The big takeaway is when we're designing these programs and we're talking about them to policymakers, it's good to think through their big fears, right? So mixed news there. Withdrawal doesn't worsen outcomes, but inequality remains a concern. And so if you are using these incentives, it's very important to have complementary support or measures for the weakest schools and even potentially the weakest students like we saw in the public schools. Then, medium stakes, cheap but attractive, that's a nice rule of thumb to use. They seem to work pretty okay. And then it's important to be realistic, right? So impacts are going to be modest and not all teachers will respond. But the big point is that if we are thinking of using these incentives to really change teacher effort or teacher motivation, then we are delusional, right? If we are thinking that these types of incentives will really be an alternative to systemic reforms in how we recruit teachers, how we train teachers, how we deploy teachers, then we are misguided, right? It's none of those things. So these incentives are not really going to be the surgery that the system needs. And clearly that surgery is what we need to be focusing on. We need to be focusing on the system reforms. But in the very short run, right, tomorrow, if we want to improve the experience of the student who's going to school and not really learning too much, then these incentives are something to consider, right? And that kind of improvement, which is small but meaningful, can be important, right? So the incentives are not surgery. They are just short-term pain relief, right? But when you're in pain, short-term pain relief is nothing to sneer at. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to present joint work. This is work undertaken in Rwanda collectively with Claire Lever, Peter Sir-Niels, and Owen Ogier. And we're going to be talking actually about the question that Svetlana just posed, which is kind of what is the systemic consequences of introducing a pay-for-performance system in the public sector. And in particular, I guess we heard it laid out nicely by Justin in the introduction that there's really this kind of two-headed problem in human resource management in many education systems in lower income countries, which is that on the one hand, you have a skills gap. And so you have teachers who lack the competence in the material that they are meant to teach. And on the other hand, you have a kind of effort gap where at least as measured by absenteeism and other things, it seems like teachers are not doing everything that we would hope that they should in order to deliver good learning outcomes. So how do we get to a place where we have a classroom like this one, which we visited, where a teacher is both competent and doing exciting things? This is not the most exciting moment, but leading them around the courtyard and all these things. How do we get to that place? So in fact, this is a pretty this is an issue not special to education, but actually a problem across the civil service or civil service reform in developing countries, which is that these twin problems of how to recruit the best people and how to motivate them and how to retain at least the ones who are good and maybe not the ones who are not is something sort of we should be thinking about in many dimensions of the civil service. We are accumulating evidence, including some that we've just heard, on how pay-for-performance contracts can elicit effort from a given group of teachers, and you saw the nice literature review just a moment ago, but we know very little about this kind of, the economist's hammer that we're taking to this problem as to whether that is actually having positive consequences on the recruitment and retention margins. So we know some things about how to recruit civil servants from other sectors. So we know that higher pay can do good things on the recruitment margin. We've seen this in the work of Dalbo et al. In Mexico. We've seen that sort of careerist motivations do not hurt and in fact may help the quality of people who are attracted to health sector positions, and that sort of beliefs about monetary incentives can also be sort of, a bit of a double-edged sword in the case of community health workers in Uganda. Okay. So what should we expect then when we think about the potential consequences across the board of introducing performance incentives for teachers? Well, we think there are really kind of two views, and you can put people in two fairly divided camps here. On the one hand is a pessimistic camp who believe that across all of these margins, the long-run effects of performance incentives are likely to be bad. So they will recruit the wrong types. Instead of getting kind of nicely civilly minded individuals, you will get the would-be JP Morgan bankers who instead will kind of come in and try to game the performance metric. They may lower the effort of a given stock of teachers by undermining their intrinsic motivation. So teachers were working hard because they cared, and now you tell them it's all about the money, and so they don't anymore. And they may fail to retain the right types. On the other hand is a kind of more neoclassical story that is an optimistic one, in which the kind of person who wants to work under a contract that rewards performance is a person who expects to perform well. So you might expect to see good people selecting in. People respond to incentives at the margin, so extrinsic motivation may go up. And as people learn about their performance, then the best may stay. So I think you can sort of see this literature as fairly divided into these two camps. I think I don't have to convince this audience that this is particularly important in the case of education, where teacher value added is consequential, where we're spending a lot of money, where there's a lot of variation in teacher quality, and where there is this kind of not only an effort gap, but a skills gap as well. Okay. The other thing that makes this hard and potentially important is that it's really hard to figure out before the fact who's going to be a good teacher. And so there's evidence from across the particularly from developed ed countries rather than developing countries that screening ex ante for teacher quality is going to be a hard thing to do. But teachers may know something, or potential teachers may know something that is hard to test for about whether they are likely to be a skilled and motivated teacher if on the job. And so it is possible that teachers' private knowledge, or potential teachers' private knowledge, can induce positive self-selection. Okay, so what we're going to do then is something which is sort of also thought about in HR policies around the world, which is to think about can we raise salaries not just by sort of unconditionally improving the salaries for teachers, but by tilting the pay scale in the direction of performance. And what we're going to do specifically in this study is we're going to provide a sort of experimental variation at the labor market level in the kinds of contracts that teachers can apply for, and see whether we induce better teachers to appear. We're going to do this by way of context, in a context in which the public sector wage premium is not particularly high. So you can see Rwanda is here. So in some settings you may think, and in particular in other East African countries, you may think of kind of these as extremely high-paid, rewarding jobs that everybody wants. And so sort of the supply side of labor may not be a constraint there. Here, and I think as is common in many countries, the public sector wage premium is not particularly high. And so sort of how you can use a relatively small budget to recruit people at the margin is going to be an important question. Okay, so how do we go about this? We are going to experimentally evaluate the consequences of two different contracts. These contracts have the same payout on average, which is 3% of teachers' annual salaries. And that 3% is pegged to an amount which is used by the government of Rwanda across its civil service as a form of performance incentive called imihigo, which is typically in other ministries done as a manager to managee sort of subjective performance evaluation. In the education sector at the time of our study, this was implemented as just a flat 3% salary. So there was no existing performance incentive for teachers, or at least not in terms of salary. There were a few sort of smaller pieces of incentives in the system. Okay, so we'll compare two things then. On the one hand, we will compare a fixed wage contract that will pay teachers at the end of the year 3% of their salaries on average. That's 20,000 Rwandan francs. And we will compare that with the consequences of a pay for performance contract, which is going to be all or nothing, with the best 1 out of 5 teachers on this metric winning the prize. The prize, if you win it, is 100,000 Rwandan francs, so that's 15% of your salary. And the metric on the basis of which this is constructed is a combination of learning outcomes on the one hand, and also measures of teachers' inputs into the classroom, which was quite important, I should emphasize, to the Ministry of Education as a way of kind of aligning this with some of their professional standards. We also think may be important to the consequences of the incentive overall. So half of this is going to be based on a Barlevian-Neal style performance incentive, or learning metric rather. And the other part is going to be based on sort of 3 Ps of inputs, which is teachers' preparation, their pedagogy, and their presence. Okay, so how are we going to implement this? So what we're going to do in this study is a 2-stage randomization along the line of Ashraf, Berry, and Shapiro, or Carlin and Zinman. I think we also heard a paper along this line from Priya Mukherjee yesterday, who's also borrowing from this idea. So we have 6 districts in our study, and we have 3 subjects of qualification by which teachers can apply for a job. So you can either be qualified as a modern languages teacher, you can be qualified as a math and sciences teacher, or as a social studies teacher. Right? Together, these comprise 18 labor markets, if you will. And those 18 labor markets are more than 60% of the planned hiring of the government of Rwanda in the year of our study. So they comprise a substantial share of the total teacher labor market in that year. So what do? Well, at the first stage, we take these district subjects and we either advertise performance contracts or we advertise fixed wage contracts for all upper primary placed individuals who are new hires in those relevant labor markets. So you're either applying for a job which you expect to be pay for performance, or you're applying for a job which you expect to be fixed wage. Secondly, we trace every teacher who's hired and placed into an upper primary teaching position in that year, down to the schools in which they are placed, and they're placed ultimately in 164 different schools. There's more than 300 teachers who are hired in that round under these lines. And we re-randomize at the school level so that each school as a whole is either experiencing a performance contract or is experiencing a fixed wage contract, right? And teachers are working in a natural environment in which it's not just the one recruited teacher who happened to be part of our study who's under this performance contract, but it's them and their peers as it would work in a natural setting. Okay. So what does this allow us to do? Well, this design allows us to make three types of comparisons, you might imagine. On the first hand, if we just compare all teachers down the branch of advertised pay for performance with advertised fixed wage, this allows us to say something about the pure compositional effect, holding constant the conditions under which you actually taught. Secondly, within any given branch in terms of how people were advertised, the comparison of individuals who experience performance contracts and experience fixed wage contracts gets at a pure effort margin response, with the caveat that we're watching these teachers over a couple of years, and so we're going to pick up both their effort, but we'll also pick up any differential attrition that this might induce, and that's an object of study here as well. Thirdly, then, if you want to think about kind of what is the big question that we don't know, the big question that we don't know from a policy perspective is what is the total consequence of introducing performance incentives into such a system, net of both the compositional and the effort margin responses. And you can pick that up from sort of thinking about people who were both advertised and working under performance contracts with individuals who are both advertised and working under fixed wage contracts. Okay, what are we going to look at here? I'll be a little bit quick because I need to show you some results. We'll look at the universe of applications here. We'll look at the characteristics of teachers who were placed. We'll look at how students learned under those teachers over the course of 2 years. And we'll look at teachers' inputs, like were they there and the like. Okay. In particular, we're going to focus on studying 6 specific questions, which we committed ourselves to. And so that is that we can see differential application qualities on the one hand, that we can see that the skills who were that the teachers who were actually placed in those schools had either different skills or different motivations as measured by a dictator game. I'll show you in a moment. And then we'll look at whether we see actually better selection on the learning outcomes for either advertised or experienced fixed wages. And finally, we'll look at how people sort of responded to the elements of the performance contract itself. Okay. Okay, so what do we see? Well, so the first thing that we see is that we don't induce measurable differences in teacher quality based on the teacher training college exam scores of applicants into these 2 different pools. So if you applied the applicant pool, sort of the universe of applications at the district level as they evaluate these things as they come in, they look strikingly similar. That is in part because these labor markets are a little bit porous, and so just because you apply for one district doesn't mean you can't apply for another. So we see a fair amount, about 50% of teachers in our sample apply to more than one district, and so there's some overlap in those of individuals across those 2 distributions. Of course, you can't actually take 2 jobs, and so where people actually go will still tell us about their desire to work under these different contracts. So we then turn to think about what are the characteristics of those teachers as they arrive in the schools at baseline. We look at 2 things. One, can we, by assessing their skills, see whether they are higher skilled teachers or not? And 2, can we see whether they are more motivated individuals or not, getting at our sort of JP Morgan worry here. So on the skill measures, we don't see differences there either in terms of the measurable skills of teachers. But on the motivation story, we do start to see evidence of the sort of of bringing in individuals who are less publicly minded, more motivated by their own private returns. And we see that by playing a frame dictator game with the recruits as our measure of their sort of public sector motivation. We ask them to divide money, this is in their first week on the job, between money they can keep for themselves and money that will be put into school supplies for the students that they are going to teach. And we see that people who applied for pay-for-performance jobs and took them up keep a substantially higher share of that pot for themselves. So it looks like these are people who are sort of in it for the money to a greater extent, if that might have been your prior. On the other hand, what will really matter is kind of net of both their skills and their motivation. Are they delivering better learning? Right. And so to look briefly at that, in the first year, across the 2 years, in terms of the pure compositional effect, we see mixed and small results on the value added of teachers in the classroom who applied under advertised P4P. When we then go to look at the experience of performance contracts, we find that the experience of performance contracts does motivate teachers to deliver better learning, and that these recruits evolve over the 2 years so that by their second year, they're delivering about 0.16 standard deviations of learning more than teachers who are working under a fixed wage contract. Taking those two things together, they deliver about 0.21 standard deviations. So a teacher who is both applying under and working under a performance contract delivers about 0.21 standard deviations more of learning, which is equivalent to about a year's worth of a typical teacher in reading and about 2 years worth of a typical teacher in math. Okay. So I'll say we see some of these things turn up in some of the measures of the performance contract. So they are also present more and they also teach better according to sort of measures of pedagogy, and we don't see this to be driven by differential attrition of lesser skilled teachers. So to conclude, these performance contracts change the composition of the teaching workforce, but don't bring in teachers who actually deliver lower value added. Teachers raise their effort, and the sort of headline takeaway here is that it's about a quarter of the total of this substantial 2-year effect that is driven by the composition rather than the effort margins of these contracts. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Thorsten, and I'm going to talk about factor misallocation in education systems. And I'm also going to talk about teachers. So, as we all know, large amounts of money, both from governments and development aid, are dedicated to education, and yet learning levels remain low in many developing countries. So this raises the question whether not only lack of resources for education, but also inefficient allocation of the existing resources is holding back education in developing countries. In this paper, I ask more specifically whether inefficient allocation of teachers across public primary schools holds back learning in developing countries. Why do I focus on public primary school teachers? Mainly for 2 reasons. Public primary education is universal. It's basically free, compulsory, and very largely public everywhere. And secondly, there's one key common input into primary education across all countries, and that is teachers. So this allows me to compare the allocation of teachers across schools between countries of all income levels. So this paper basically has 2 parts. In the first part, I simply document a set of stylized facts about how teachers are distributed across public primary schools within countries. And then in the second one, I basically conduct a very simple CA clinotype exercise, trying to understand whether the distributions that we observe could be efficient. Let me start with the first one, with the facts. So in order to understand how teachers are distributed across schools within countries, I basically engaged in a very large global data collection exercise where I started by visiting the website of every Ministry of Education and Statistical Institute in the world to collect school census data. As you can imagine, a lot of this data is not publicly available, so this was a lot of writing letters, emails, making phone calls, traveling, and so on. But at the end of it, I managed to put data together from 1.8 million public primary schools that are attended by 302 million pupils, which is almost 1/4 of all the children worldwide between the ages of 5 and 14. And they are taught by 13 million teachers. Together, they represent the public primary school sector in 88 countries. And for 73 of those, I basically have information on the universe of public primary schools. Then in 6 countries, I have the school census from a subset of the states. And finally, I use representative school survey data in another 9 countries. This map shows you in black all the countries for which I obtained data, and you can see it really covers all continents and also the entire income range from poor countries like Malawi all the way to rich countries like Sweden. So the data contains, for these 3 key elements for this study, it contains also more information, but that I'm not using here. So the first one that's important for me is the pupil-teacher ratio, because I only look at the allocation of teachers in terms of numbers of teachers. I'm not looking at quality or characteristics of teachers here. And so I compute the pupil-teacher ratio at every school simply as the ratio of the pupil head count over the teacher head count. The second piece of information that's important for me is the location of the school, and that's either given by the administrative unit, and then in a large set of countries, I also have GPS coordinates. And then finally, I have measures of pupil performance at the school level in the form of test scores from national exams in 10 countries at the moment. So what does the distribution of pupil-teacher ratios across schools within countries look like? So here I'm showing you the distribution of pupil-teacher ratios in 2 high-income countries, the UK and the US. And what you can see is that the average is around 20, and there's a little bit of variation around that, but they look pretty similar. And for the sake of comparison, I will have the US distribution in red in the background in all the following graphs. Now, as you move down the income ladder, what we can see is that in countries like Peru or South Africa that are upper middle income countries, you have a little bit more variation and a slightly higher average. As you move further down, the variation starts to increase, and you see how there is a right tail that starts to develop, and this becomes even more extreme when you look at low-income countries like Mozambique or Cambodia. So you can see that you really have schools with pupil-teacher ratios below 20 and above 150 in the same country. So this is the first stylized fact that I'm reporting, and here I'm showing you the full data so that you can be sure I didn't cherry-pick those 8 countries. The ones that we have seen are marked in red, and basically I'm plotting the coefficient of variation in pupil-teacher ratio against GDP per capita here, and you can see that there's a negative correlation. Now, when you go and look at the spatial distribution of pupil-teacher ratios within countries, what I find is that a lot of the variation in the low-income countries is actually within second-tier administrative units, so the equivalent of districts in Africa, municipalities in Latin America, typically. This is a map of Zambia, just to give you an example, and the black lines are the district borders, and I'm coloring basically the areas around the schools based on the pupil-teacher ratio, red for high, green for low, and you can see in many districts you have both of the colors at the same time. So this seems to be relatively local, although, of course, districts in Africa are not that small. Now, one question that I often get at this point is this a rural-urban phenomenon? And I think the answer is not, even though what I find is that pupil-teacher ratios are larger in rural areas in low-income countries. Those coefficients that I get are very small, and it turns out I can only explain 3% of the variation in pupil-teacher ratios within a country using a measure of rurality like the population density around the school or, for example, nighttime luminosity. The fourth fact that I report is that the differences in pupil-teacher ratios that we see tend to reinforce educational inequality that is existing. So basically, I merge the school census data with DHS data, and then I have information on the education of adults in the areas that are around the schools. And so I find that basically in the areas where adults are more literate, pupil-teacher ratios are significantly lower. And finally, also perhaps not surprising, is the schools that have higher pupil-teacher ratios also tend to be less well-equipped in other dimensions, so they tend to have higher pupil-classroom ratios, so that is to say they have less classrooms as well, and also less toilets on average. Now, basically what we've seen so far is that there's massive inequality in access to education in low-income countries, and it seems to increase the already existing inequality. But you could still argue that this may be efficient, because if all those inputs are complements in an education production function, it may make sense not to send teachers to places where parents are very uneducated, where there are no classrooms, and so on. So the second part of the paper is trying to understand, would there be ways to reallocate teachers and actually raise aggregate learning? Now, to do this, I basically write down a very simple model of teacher allocation. So I have a social planner who allocates teachers to schools with the objective to maximize aggregate learning in the country, which I measure as the sum of pupil test scores in the country. And then there's an education production function which is going to map pupil-teacher ratios at the school level into learning, and a budget constraints that says that you need to pay all the teachers in the country. The education production function that I write down looks like this. So it's basically a very simple Cobb-Douglas setup. HS here is the average pupil test score at the school S, and it's simply the product of a school productivity term A and the pupil-teacher ratio to the beta. Of course, the school productivity term here, the TFP, is different from the TFP in like a firm equivalent of this, because it's also capturing differentials in demand-side factors like parent characteristics, basically between the regions in which schools are. Now, in this model, you would like to, in the optimum, you would like to equate marginal products. So what I can do, I can compute the marginal products given this production function. And here, I'm only going to show you results for 2 countries, because for the short time that I have, I won't be able to show you that many graphs. So this is for the UK and for Tanzania. And what you can notice here is there's a lot more dispersion in marginal products in Tanzania than in the UK. And this is actually independent of the value of beta that you choose in this model. Now, if you were to allocate teachers optimally, according to the model, what would the distribution of pupil-teacher ratios look like? So you'll probably not see much of a difference in the distributions here. So it's actually the fact that the inequality in pupil-teacher ratios that you would generate by allocating them optimally wouldn't be very different. It would be very similar. But what is changing, and what you can't see here, but what is changing in the background is the matching between the number of teachers and the school productivity terms. And that's what can actually generate gains in aggregate learning. So if you compute what's the gain in the average test score that can be reached by this reallocation, I find that this ranges between 3 and 15% in Tanzania, depending, of course, on how important pupil-teacher ratios are for learning. So I'm varying the beta between 0.25 and 0.75. But you see that the values for Tanzania are much larger than for the UK. And to benchmark this, I do a second simulation and I say, let's hold fixed the relative pupil-teacher ratios between schools, and let's ask how many additional teachers would we have to hire in order to get an equivalent gain in the test scores. And so what I find is that you would have to increase the workforce by between 14 and 20% in Tanzania to get an equivalent gain. In the UK, this would be much smaller, only between 4 and 6%. And then finally, I compute how much this would actually cost in terms of salary of teachers every year. And you can see, annually it would cost in Tanzania between 9 and 13% of government primary school expenditure. So it would be quite expensive. So let me conclude. I think we've seen that there's large variation in pupil-teacher ratios across public primary schools in low-income countries. And the simulations suggest that reallocating teachers could lead to substantial gains in aggregate learning outcomes. And it also seems like teacher reallocation could be more cost-effective than hiring additional teachers. So coming back to Justin's point, I think what I want to argue is that in addition to a teacher competence problem and a teacher effort problem, we may also have a teacher allocation problem. Thank you.
All right. An exciting and amazingly coherent and interrelated session. We've got 15 minutes for question and answers, so let's see if we can maybe get in 2 rounds. And I see Rafael and Karthik off the bat, so Rafael, please. You need a mic up front. Here we go.
Rafa de Hoyos from the World Bank. Well, first of all, wonderful presentation by Svetlana. I have a question for Svetlana. So let's assume that I am a policymaker and I am seeing your results, and you convince me that this is the way to go about increasing learning. But I will have to set up a standardized test for all grades every year. And if I go to secondary school, the standardized test will have to include not only math and learning out and reading comprehension, which is what they usually include, but also subject-specific like science, biology, chemistry, which means that it's virtually impossible to implement at a large scale. What would you have to say about that? And although I know that I am only restricted to 1 question per day, I am taking advantage of the fact that I have the microphone to Thorsten. What's the effect on in a They fear you, man. What's the effect on inequality? Because you were talking about the effects only on average. Well, what happened to the dispersion?
Thank you. Karthik?
Yeah, this is a great session. So 2 quick questions for Thorsten. So first is, how much of this variation is just because of integer constraints? Like, so if you look at the enrollment, then by construction, given whatever pupil-teacher ratio schools have, countries and systems have, it would be nice to kind of, net that out and see what's left. And then the second thing, maybe you went through this too fast for the simulations, is you need a functional form assumption between PTR and outcomes at different levels of PTR. And it wasn't clear how you were doing that and where you were getting that from, right? So, because if it's linear, then there's no free lunch from reallocation, right? So there has to be some nonlinearity in that functional form, right? So I wasn't sure where that was coming from. And for Andrew, the design's fantastic, right? So this is absolutely awesome stuff in terms of taking both the selection and the incentive, the effort margin. So 2 questions. I mean, one is, there is this kind of Carlin Zinman, what I think Priya was presenting yesterday as well, that there's one version of how you recruit, and then there's the other version of the contract they actually experience, right? So, but is there a little bit of IRB/cognitive disconnect in that, you're recruiting under one regime and then have people in another one. And frankly, that's less my concern and more about whether we're really picking up the long-term selection effects, like from a one-off like this, where you're not credibly changing the rules of the game, because as demonstrated by you, that you managed to switch the contract they were in relative to what they were recruited under. So,
All right. All the way in the back against the wall.
Hi, I'm Sabrine from University of Delaware. Following up on Karthik's question for Torsten, you have a production function for learning outcomes in schools, and again, I guess maybe you went over this too fast, but you must have made some assumptions on how you get a productivity term for each school. So if you could just go over how you get that number and how you calculate the gains from reallocation based on each school's TFP.
Let's give Lance a shot here down at the front. Oh, you were. No, authors can't ask co-authors questions. You can ask somebody.
I can ask my co-author a question. I had a question for Farva. It seemed like you documented a kind of convincing association between some of the negative things that a teacher might experience or recognize that are going on, either in terms of the personal or the professional, and learning outcomes. And I wanted to get a sense of how hard you could push what we're sort of thinking of as identification here. So if I'm a teacher who's frustrated, maybe I just don't actually like teaching that much, and I arrive and I say, this is a frustrating environment, but it's really that I just don't like teaching that much. In general, it doesn't matter where I was going to go, I was going to say it was frustrating. So I don't have a sense of how much we can know about how much it's about the teacher, what they bring with them, and how much it's about what they find in the environment to which they're assigned. But I think you have really rich data, so I wonder if you've given thought to how you might sort of press that. One suggestion might be that if more teachers come into the school, then the first set of teachers can be thought of as inspectors about the environment. And then the next cohort of teachers arrives, and you can see, was it in fact a measure of the environment, or was it a measure of the inspector? Anyway, I would just wonder in your data whether you can push that further. Thanks.
All right, why don't we go ahead before your memories fade here and try to run through those. Maybe we should start in order from this end. Torsten, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So on your question, what's the effect on inequality? I'm not sure I interpret your question correctly, but one thing I can do is I can say, let's simulate what would happen if we basically equalize pupil-teacher ratios to the extent that it's possible given the integer constraints that Karthik was mentioning. And what I find, if you do that, then you'd actually lose a little bit of aggregate learning. So there is a cost to doing that because of the complementarities, essentially. Then the next question on the integer constraints, so I can simulate that through, and that's basically a tiny share of what we're seeing of the variation. That's not an issue here. On the nonlinearity, yes, I do need an assumption. So I basically need the beta to be larger than -1 for me to still have, I mean, depending on how you map it, the concavity or convexity that I need for this to go through. And then on the question, how do I actually get the productivity terms? I basically have data on the test scores. So I have the age, and I have data on the pupil-teacher ratio. So I can just invert the production function and back out the productivity terms. So it's a very simple thing that I do here. And then, I mean, how do I get the optimal allocation? I know that marginal product should be equalized, so I can basically, with an algorithm, simply search for the point where I can equalize that given the stock of teachers that is available. I think that's great.
Andy, did they know you were lying to them when you recruited these teachers?
So they knew that they would get at least what they applied under. And so your question brings up an important detail. So when we did the re-randomization, the way that we were able to do that in a way which was fully incentive compatible and which people could opt out of if they wanted to, but no one did, was that we introduced the re-randomization with a bonus, a one-time signing bonus that covered sort of the gap between the fixed wage payout of 20,000 Rwandan francs and the full payout of the bonus if you were to win it under the pay for performance contract. So in essence, by providing a signing bonus that was simultaneously with this re-randomization, we made sure that everybody got at least as much as they could conceivably have expected under whatever contract they applied for, regardless of their beliefs. So even if they thought they would win the performance contract for sure. So in that sense, everybody's outcomes were stochastically dominated the outcomes under the contracts under which they applied for, if you like. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be an issue there, for sure. And so I think the potential issue in terms of people responding to changes in contract relative to what was advertised is addressed in two ways. One, we allow for in secondary work, we allow for the interaction between those two, between the experienced and the advertised contract, which is one place you might expect that to show up. We find that the consequences of experiencing a pay for performance contracts are indistinguishable amongst those who applied for it and those who applied under a fixed wage contract, which is also interesting if you think there might be selection on your ability to kind of respond to a contract that you would want to gain, for instance. And so it's also sort of not consistent with that story. And then we also look at satisfaction. So consistent actually with your own work, we find that people are generally pretty happy with these contracts. 70% of teachers say they like them, and that's true respective of the arm into which they were. So whether they came straight into the performance contract or indirectly through the re-randomization. On long-term selection effects, entirely agree. So we were able to promise a 2-year contract over and above civil service salaries. All of these are proper civil service jobs here. But we didn't have a longer term grant than that, so we couldn't commit more than that up front. And that's clearly important if you want to think about the systemic consequences of this. So you should think of this as that's in a sense a story about the power of the intervention. How powerful is knowing you'll get this for 2 years? And is that enough to induce differential selection? In the other thing I would say is that, so here, these have to be individuals who came through the teacher training college system in order to get these jobs. So you might worry in the very long term about, can you get people to go through teacher training that wouldn't otherwise have done so? For context, the teacher training colleges are almost like the secondary degree of last resort in Rwanda. They're sort of the bottom of the pile. So maybe that margin is possible. I think that's a hard margin to push on. People who leave teacher training colleges, half of them work in teaching and half of them do not, and pay is about equal across the two. So we think we're getting at the relevant margin of selection for this context, but it's certainly possible that over a longer term you'd get different kinds of selection.
Svetlana, can anybody actually do this at scale in practice?
So if a policymaker saw these results and said, yeah, let's do it, I'd be a little bit worried about what I had just said to him. But so I think that the easiest way to think about this is that at the points where the system is already doing standardized tests, these would be relatively, it would be possible to implement them. And then at the subnational level, more and more we are seeing that there are, at the region level or at the district level, schools are being given similar tests, or the district officers or the district administration is trying to standardize within that level testing at different points. So the idea is, if your education system is thinking about doing some kind of standardization, whether at the national level or at different subnational levels at different points in the education career, it's worthwhile to think about rewarding teachers who are really showing improvement in student performance, and that was the way I was thinking about it. But yes, you're absolutely right. If this was to be built from scratch, it would not be as suggested.
And Farwa, which way does causation go, from underperforming students to grumbling teachers, or vice versa?
That's a good point. So I mean, here, because these teachers are coming from the College of Education, we're thinking that they're here because they want to teach. But of course, it could be that some of them don't like teaching, and it's just because of that, and not necessarily because of their personal and professional conditions. So controlling for something like that would definitely be one way to go about, if there's some indicator that kind of identifies. But if not, what you're suggesting, if we have multiple cohorts, where you're saying we could look at them as teachers in first cohort and inspectors in the second cohort, from what I understand. Here we have the same cohort which is being followed over time, but I think follow-up studies could kind of switch it the other way around and look at that. Yeah, but that's a really good point.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I think we're about out of time here, so we're gonna have to close it off at one round of questions here. But I feel like, you know, over the years here at RISE, we're making real progress, I think, at kind of trying to integrate now some of these threads around recruitment and selection and motivation, and didn't mean to ring that bell, and retention, and bringing in this allocation piece, which, you know, is exploratory but new and an interesting new angle here. So I look forward to more teacher human resource sessions with more experiments that I know are in the field and future iterations of this conference. With that, we're going to bring this session to a close, but before you get up and go, I have to make a somewhat complex logistical lunch announcement. So we're going to break for lunch now and invite you to get your lunch and to come back for our 12:45 lunchtime panel on big efforts in education. Laura Savage from DFID is going to moderate. Penelope Goldberg, from the chief economist from the World Bank, Rafael Martinez from GPE, and Bronwyn McGrath from the University of Oxford will be up here on stage starting at 12:45. So go get food, come back in. If you decide, oh, I've set up a lunch meeting and I'm going to meet my co-author, can you please let people who are coming back in get their food first? And make sure that your lunchtime discussions aren't out here in the back, because we will hear you. It's a very, the acoustics are quite porous here. So if you're congregating in the back during the lunch session, we're all gonna hear you and be glowering at you. So if go out, get your food, come back in. If you're not planning to come back in, hold off to the back of the line and make sure you're not congregating immediately back here. All right, see you here in 15 minutes.